This wasn't how Dantes had hoped his first day at the Vixen would unfold, but he had no doubts about how to react when someone tried to slap him. He moved swiftly, bringing his left arm down where the attacker's arm bent, then drove a punch forward, his knuckle aimed directly at the man's eye. The strike landed perfectly. The man released him, staggering back, but Dantes wasn't done. He seized the man's shoulders and slammed his knee into his crotch hard. The man crumpled, dropping to his knees and stumbling backward before managing to push himself onto all fours, baring his fangs. It might have been intimidating in a dark forest, but in broad daylight, outside a brothel, it looked more pathetic than menacing. Dantes let out a short, amused laugh and pulled his dagger free. The man eyed the weapon warily before forcing himself upright, his expression contorted with pain before settling into a neutral facade. "You need to come with me." Dantes kept his dagger raised. "I'm not on the menu, buddy. Even if I was, you couldn't afford me." For a brief moment, the man's face twisted into a scowl before he composed himself. "It is your duty to come with me." "No," Dantes replied, tilting his head. "I'm fairly certain it's not." There was something oddly familiar about the man, but Dantes wasn't keen on engaging with someone who had just tried to drag him away for no reason. The man scowled, nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air. His gaze darted around, noting the small crowd gathering to watch the scene unfold. Tyra stood in the brothel's doorway, watching intently. The man pointed at Dantes. "I will return for you when the moon is full." Dantes arched an eyebrow and pointed his dagger right back at him. "And I'll kick your ass then, too." Without another word, the man dropped to all fours and sprinted away, his movements unervingly fast. Dantes tried tracking him through nearby rats and roaches, but the man was too quick. Within moments, he was gone. Dantes frowned, sheathing his knife. That guy was weird. Tyra, now leaning against him, nodded. "Yeah." Dantes shrugged and walked her back inside, taking his post at the entrance once more. He didn't dwell on it too much. Lunatics weren't exactly rare in the city. He recalled a nobleman who used to streak through the guild district wearing only a mask. That guy just paid a fine and got away with it, until he tried it in Midtown, which ended differently. "I had a customer like that once," Tyra mused. Dantes raised an eyebrow. "Liked to growl and pretend he was a dog. Some noble's cousin, I think. Never wanted to sleep with me, just had me feed him from a bowl and scratch his stomach." Dantes slowly raised his other eyebrow as he listened. Tyra laughed at his expression. "I figured you'd have seen worse, considering how well you seem to know places like the Vixen." He nodded. "I do, but there's always some new vice or fetish to learn about, I suppose." Shortly after, Tyra was entertaining a blushing young sailor at the bar, leaving Dantes alone at his post. Despite himself, he found his mind lingering on the strange man. Something about him nagged at his thoughts, though he wasn't sure why. Shaking his head, he redirected his focus to Jacopo. Their usual mental handshake passed, and soon Dantes was seeing through the rat's eyes. Jacopo was prowling a dark alley, sniffing at a bakery door. The warm scent of freshly baked bread drifted from a narrow crack. His stomach rumbled. Finding a small opening in the wall, he climbed up and squeezed inside, only to slam into an invisible barrier. He squeaked in irritation and backed out, landing on the cobblestones before skittering away. That was the 5th time he had encountered such an enchantment. Dantes frowned. Some kind of new anti-rat spell? That wasn't around when I was in the pit. Must be a recent development. He recalled seeing rats and roaches in nearly every restaurant and bakery in Rendhold. "Have you checked the areas I mentioned yet?" "Not yet. I was hoping to eat first." "Fair enough. Some bakeries toss out stock at the end of the day for cheap. The crummier pubs buy it up for the next day. You might want to try then. I want it fresh." Dantes sighed. "Tomorrow morning, I'll get you something. I want it fresh, and I want to take it. Then we need another plan." Dantes scratched his chin. If uptown bakeries had these enchantments, other buildings might too, including Mondego and Mercedes Estate. He needed someone who could break such wards. Dario might know someone, even if he wasn't the type to break rules himself. Jacopo abandoned the bakery and continued his exploration. Dantes followed along, updating his mental map. The city had changed, More boarded-up windows, pubs turned to drug dens, restaurants openly serving cat and dog meat. Many brothel workers bore sores, bloodshot eyes, and signs of addiction, far younger than they should have been for such a profession. Dantes clenched his jaw. He had seen brothels that ran without standards before, places that got girls hooked on dust, skipped priestly cleansings, and took in those far too young. Once the girls were used up, they were tossed into the streets. Midtown had always been rough. Dantes wasn't nostalgic about it. Every bad thing in his life had happened there. He had been beaten, nearly drowned, and watched his mother waste away. Still, there had been some good. People looked out for one another. The gangs were easier to deal with than the city guard. Much like him, weren't singled out. Now it just seemed worse. Jacopo moved onward until spotting a man in a breastplate walking up the street. Doors shut at his approach, whores ducked into alleys, and one dealer scrambled onto a rooftop. His armor bore the winged sword insignia of the guard, and his belt held a standard-issue sword. He was tall, leanly muscled, with thinning dark hair and a salt and pepper beard. His brows were furrowed, his walk purposeful. "Follow him," Dantes instructed Jacopo. Jacopo, having no luck with food, complied, weaving through pedestrians as he tracked the guardsman. The man turned down an alley. Before Jacopo could follow, 3 men bolted out, but one was caught by the collar and thrown back in. Jacopo rounded the corner to see the guardsman looming over a young man in ragged clothes with glassy gray eyes. "Well, hello there, Ket," the guard said. "Heard you were back from hard labor. Already dealing again." "Pasha, no. Just talking to friends." Dantes recognized the name. Pasha, the one guardsman in Midtown who actually did his job. Pasha moved closer, forcing Ket against the wall. "Any news on Mondego yet?" Ket whispered, "Not yet. If you rough me up too often, they'll notice." 2 weeks, Ket. I kept you out of the pit, got your sentence reduced. You'll pay for what you've done, one way or another. Ket exhaled shakily. "Fine. I think they'll let me pick up a dust shipment soon. I'll let you know." Pasha flicked a silver coin onto Ket's chest. "Make sure you do. Don't make me find you." With that, he kicked Ket lightly in the ribs and walked off. Ket groaned, shooting a weak, rude gesture at his back. Dantes observed the exchange between Ket and Pasha through Jacopo's eyes with keen interest. Zach had mentioned Pasha back in the pit, a rare guardsman genuinely trying to clean up Midtown. Dantes doubted the man would live long enough to make any meaningful changes, but that didn't mean he couldn't be useful in the meantime. Ket might also prove valuable. After all, Dantes already had an affinity for rats. A cough pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Tilly subtly gesturing with her chin toward one of the couches. He had been too absorbed in his observations and had lost track of what was happening around him. Following her cue, his eyes landed on a large sailor aggressively pressing a drink towards Sarah's lips. "Come on, love. Just have a couple of these to loosen up. Don't be a bitch about it." Sarah kept her mouth firmly shut, refusing to take a sip. The man lifted a heavy hand to grip her face, only to stop when he felt a crushing grip on his shoulder. "I'm going to need you to let her go," Dantes said, tightening his grasp just enough to make the man wince. The sailor scoffed, sizing him up. "I'm just trying to share a drink with a lady. Isn't it her job to make me comfortable? Not until you've paid her and gone upstairs. Even then, she doesn't have to drink with you. She has clients all day. She can't get drunk with every single one. Bad for business." The sailor shook his head. "I don't sleep with sober women." Pathetic, Dantes thought, though he kept the sentiment to himself. "Then you shouldn't be in a whorehouse at noon. Come back later. Everyone will be drinking then." The man bristled and stood up, looming over Dantes by nearly 1.5 feet. "Is there a problem with me spending my hard-earned silver here?" Dantes sighed. He had tried to be diplomatic for Sarah's sake. He had seen too many bouncers ruin the girls' earnings by getting too aggressive with handsy customers. More often than not, the girls didn't need saving. They just needed the men to remember that actions had consequences and that the girls belonged to the house. After that, the men usually paid and things proceeded as expected. "Leave." The sailor blinked. "What? Leave?" Dantes pointed to the door, brushing his coat aside to rest his hand on his dagger. The sailor eyed the weapon, then Dantes, weighing his options. Dantes prepared for an attack, but surprisingly, the man deflated, shaking his head before turning toward the exit. Dantes frowned as he watched him go. He had been certain the man would take a swing at him, but perhaps his time in the pit had skewed his instincts. Maybe he had lost his ability to read men who were used to civilized society. He turned back to Sarah. "You all right?" "No," she huffed. "That dumb bastard wasted an hour of my time. He basically stole silver right out of my pocket." Dantes nodded. "You're a lot of men's type. You'll have no trouble finding another customer. The hostess spot is open if you want it." She nodded and moved to take her place, standing beside him. At first, her expression was neutral. Then it turned annoyed. Finally, she crossed her arms. "You should have beaten him." Dantes smirked. "Oh, I should have. He wasted our time and manhandled me. If he'd actually hurt you, there would have been a beating. But he didn't. Bad for business. Decker would have done it. That's his prerogative." Dantes shrugged. He could tell she was picking at him just to vent. It reminded him of the younger children he used to watch at his mother's brothels for a few coppers. He didn't expect much maturity from someone Sarah's age, and he suspected her attitude was part of her appeal. Even in his short time at the Vixen, it was clear she was one of the top earners. That was proven again when, less than 5 minutes later, she was perched on the lap of a different sailor, pouting adorably and already wrapping him around her finger. Dantes checked back in on Jacopo, only to find his rat companion in the middle of an intimate encounter with a gray-haired female. He decided to give him some privacy. Setting the stage, Dantes clenched his jaw and tightened his fist. He had gathered some information and started identifying the tools he needed for his revenge, but it wasn't enough. His first target was Gaspard. Of the old gang, Gaspard had the most to lose and the least loyalty. He might be willing to betray the others in exchange for survival. The only problem was finding him. By the time Decker arrived, the sun was high in the sky, and his expression was grim. The rest of Dantes' shift had been uneventful, save for ejecting a man trying to pass off glamored coin, an old trick that neither he nor Tilly fell for. Snapping the coin in two revealed its wooden core, and the academy student who had tried the scam left more embarrassed than belligerent. "I can take over, Ed," Decker said. "Thanks for covering." Dantes looked him up and down. "No, you need a minute. Have a drink first. I'll cover a little longer." Decker hesitated, then gave a grateful nod and went to the bar, where Tilly teased him for his detailed wine order. By the time he returned, his expression had softened. "Thanks," he said. "No worries. Just didn't want you scaring off customers." Decker sighed. "My dad's not doing well." Dantes nodded. "That's a problem for tomorrow." With that, he stepped out onto the street. He had a few tasks before nightfall. He needed to check the docks. Zach had mentioned Mondego making peace with the smugglers, and Dantes wanted to know what that entailed. He also wanted to visit Pasha's guard office and see if there were any records on Mondego's operations. Stretching his neck and fingers, he briefly considered returning to the Vixen as a customer rather than an employee. But he shoved the thought aside and made his way down an alley, where Jacopo rejoined him, settling into his usual pocket. Following the scent of salt water, Dantes moved toward the docks. The cityscape changed. Luxury goods and taverns gave way to warehouses and shipyards. The air was thick with the stench of fish and sweat, and the crowds grew rougher. Dockhands, sailors, smugglers. He passed a man getting his throat slit in an alley, a street brawl between rival crews being broken up by guards, and a chorus of 30 men singing a bawdy shanty as they hauled freight. When the docks finally came into view, Dantes barely noticed the ships. His eyes were drawn to the vast ocean beyond the city's edge. It had been more than 5 years since he'd seen it. He savored the sight for a moment before refocusing on the hodgepodge of vessels before him. Local fishing boats, guard galleons, and merchant ships from Drashus, Timond, Visalia, and Frashiad. A volatile mix, but typical for Rendhold, one of the few neutral trade hubs that welcomed business from nations actively at war with each other. He had once shared a meal with a Visalian sailor who marveled at eating rice, tomatoes, corn, and dodo in a single dish. Dantes had taken such things for granted. As he moved deeper into the docks, a presence pricked at the edge of his awareness. "You're being followed," Jacopo sent.
Hey, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy our audiobooks, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share your review in the comments section below.
Dantes didn't react, simply continuing his walk as if he hadn't heard anything. How many? 3. He looked at the window of a nearby pub and took note of the 3 men following him in its reflection. One of them he recognized immediately as being the man Head had tossed out of the Vixen earlier in the day. Had he been following him for long? Or did he just happen to see Dantes when Head come to the docks? He shook his head. He needed to be more alert. He couldn't rely on Jacopo all of the time to watch his back. Still, it had been easier to keep track of things in the Underprison, where following people relied on darkened alcoves rather than crowds of people that he was still getting used to again. Even once he regained enough favor to have groups of rats and roaches acting as his eyes and ears, He'd still need to adjust his strategies to compensate. He sighed as he looked out across the ocean, making his way into the seedier areas closer to the water. A man escapes from prison and gets laid a few times, and that's all he needs to start losing his edge. He cracked his neck. He'd take this as an opportunity to sharpen himself. He broke into a run down the street. The 3 men tailing him started afterward once they realized what he was doing, drawing knives and clubs as they moved. Dantes wove easily through the narrow and busy streets, feeling where people would and wouldn't be with the rat senses Head gained since his first transformation. He ducked down a few alleys, leapt over a cart full of dead fish, and scaled a fishmonger's thatch roof, staying just slow enough that his pursuers could keep sight of him. Dantes saw, through Jacopo's eyes, one of them give up, heaving heavily and leaning against a wall as the other 2 continued doggedly at Novel Benedat. Eventually, Dantes ducked down an alley that was a dead end, at which point he shifted into rat form and made his way with Jacopo calmly behind a pile of refuse. The 2 men were breathing heavily as they entered the alley. "Where the fuck is he?" asked one of them. "Stay calm. I'm sure the rat fuck is here somewhere. Check the trash piles. He kicked you out of the whorehouse. You check the trash piles." The man shook his head. "Fine, you craven bastard." He started to go from pile to pile, giving each of them a quick stab with his dagger. Dantes and Jacopo scurried behind the other man, who was watching with his arms folded. Dantes returned to his human form behind the man. While it was a loud and painful process for him, it seemed near silent for everyone else. He smashed the hilt of his dagger on the side of the man's head. There was a sickening crunch, and the man crumpled, and Dantes grabbed his club as he went down. "You!" yelled the other man as he whipped around to charge him with a knife. Dantes threw the club hard with his left hand, forcing the man to dodge and briefly avert his eyes. In that moment, Dantes got within his guard and drove his elbow into the man's ribs, then followed up with a slash at the arm that held his dagger. The man nearly lost his grip on his own knife, but managed to keep a loose grip and slash at Dantes' face. Dantes dodged, receiving only a light slash across his nose. He took another step away to create more distance. He held his dagger up and pointed at the man. "Is getting kicked out of a brothel really worth killing or dying over?" He asked. "If you encounter this narrative on Amazon, note that it's taken without the author's consent. Report it." "Fuck you," said the man, pushing forward with a few more slashes that Dantes managed to avoid. "Man, you really did need to get laid." "Huh?" said Dantes, lowering his dagger and leaving an obvious opening. "I thought you sailors from Timon just used your cabin boys for that sort of thing." The man let out something between a grunt and a yowl as he lunged for the opening Dantes had left. Dantes stepped forward rather than back under the man's guard. He drove his dagger up through the man's chin. He stood there for a moment with a surprised expression balanced on the hilt of Dantes' blade. He tore his dagger free, and the man's body crumbled. Dantes knelt down and wiped his weapon on the man's jacket. The other one moan from the heap Dantes had left him in. Dantes weighed his dagger in his hand. He could kill him, but there wasn't much point to it. He was a sailor and would leave with his ship, dead friend or no. Still, it was better to be safe than sorry, so he quickly slit the man's throat. He took a moment to rob both of them, finding 12 silver and 8 copper that he slipped into his jacket pocket. He reached out his senses to the nearby vermin. Fresh meat. Dozens of rats and roaches began making their way for the lead sailor's corpse. Then a few seabirds swooped down as well, to fight the rats over the man's eyes. Dantes didn't have a lot of favor still, but that didn't mean he didn't have any options. He knelt down, looking at the nearest rat as it tore off the dead man's earlobe. "Hey, cuz, you and your friends answer some questions while you eat?" It shrugged. "Questions? Answers?" "Yes." Dantes raised an eyebrow. "They're dumber up here," said Jacopo within his mind. "Much dumber. The boats and storehouses nearby. What's in them?" "Crates and barrels." Dantes nodded, keeping his patience. "And what is in those crates and barrels?" "Most have food. Red water is in some of them," another said as he tore a bit of cheek off with his teeth. Do any of them have different things in the barrels and crates that are under those?" "Some have sharp, shiny things," chimed another. "Some have white powder. One has black powder and long metal-long tubes. I was on one with green leaves that made me hungrier when I ate them. One just had small sticks and chewy squares." "Chewy squares?" asked Dantes. He felt Jacopo go through his mind for a moment. "He means books." Dantes nodded, thinking, "So guns, dust, weed, tomes, and weapons." That was an ambitious haul to smuggle in. All of it, but dust could have just gone in the normal way, but the fees were incredibly high to do so. Except for the tomes, why those would need to be smuggled in was beyond him. Dust was high risk, not only because it was illegal, but because the majority of it was smuggled in overland by the gatemen, led by the so-called little finger of the five fingers. Moving dust by boat seemed like a sure way to piss him off. Did they know? Or was Mondego working to take a piece of his market share? The weapons were likely for the Adventurers Guild or the mercenary companies that occupied the Lower East Side. They were always in the market for cheaper steel. The guns could also be for them, or the Dwarven Enclave, and the books could only be for the Academy. All of that indicated a very strong ground operation. If Mondego was making a profit off of each item that was smuggled, that more than explained his success. The only question was how he had managed it. The fingers obviously stood to benefit, as he likely paid up to each of them and assisted with their own smuggling, but the city itself was losing profit for every speck of dust and ounce of weed he managed to get in, and the city loved its gold. Dantes stood up and brushed off his coat. He still needed more information, but this was a good start. He now knew that Mondego had built up connections all throughout the city and outside of it. Smuggling by boat had never been centralized before, but had rather been something that everyone has a small piece of. Taking full control of it was certainly a path to power, but with so many connections that had to be made to make it, there had to be weak points along the chain. Dantes just needed to find them. Dantes momentarily felt the temptation to do as Jacopo had suggested. Simply slip into Mondego's house and slit his throat while he slept rather than dismantle what was clearly a massive operation that spanned the docks and flowed like blood to every other part of the city. He stood and nodded to the vermin as they ate. "Enjoy your meal." They were too busy eating to acknowledge him, and he walked out of the alley and started to head toward Midtown. He paused for a moment to look out at the ships at the dock. A Leviathan hunter was coming into port, its quarry tethered to its hull, its skull already cracked open to gather the valuable fluids within. The rest of it would be processed for oil, its blood for alchemical sanguine that would be watered down depending on how pure you were willing to purchase it, its meat for food, and its teeth for scrimshaw. He smiled, remembering the one good piece of advice his father had ever given him. "How do you eat a Leviathan?" Head asked him with a crooked smile, his copper-topped tusks gleaming. "How?" Dantes had asked. "Same way you eat everything else, one bite at a time." Dantes skittered through the outskirts of Midtown with Jacopo, their small paws making little sound as they moved across the cracked and broken cobblestone streets. During the trek, it had gotten dark, and a near full moon rose up over the high slum towers that lined the streets of Midtown, looking poised to fall. They didn't need to go through the center of the district, as the guard station for Midtown was the only one located on the border of the district rather than in the center of it. Dantes had heard stories that when the guard did have a building in the center, it kept getting burned down or robbed. That had been very funny to him as a child, and it still brought a smile to his face as an adult. They wove through a few alleys, only stopping briefly so that Jacopo could make a meal of some rotten fish that must fallen off a cart coming up from the docks. The guard building was a simple thing, an ugly square of concrete with barred windows and the winged sword insignia emblazoned on the front. There were clumps of excrement clinging to the outside walls, and someone had painted a mockery of the guard symbol on a bare wall with a very different kind of sword between two wings. Dantes and Jacopo moved in a circle around the building, looking for a means of ingress, and eventually saw that one of the barred windows was cracked open just a bit. They moved across the ground lightly and scrambled up the wall. Guard buildings usually had alarm spells built into them, but those were for humans, not rats. He only hoped that this one didn't have the anti-rat enchantment that Jacopo had run into. Luckily, as they squeezed inside, they didn't run into any invisible walls of force. The building was dark, and they found that they were in the sleeping quarters of the building. There were more than 100 beds, but only about 20 were occupied. Small numbers made sense to Dantes. The Midtown Guard was basically a punishment, and had heard of more than a few choosing forced labor over completing their guard contract if they worked there. That being said, 20 seemed even slimmer than usual. Had they been diverted to watch the Underprison, or was there something else going on that had led to their slimmer numbers? Dantes moved under the beds and searched for an exit, eventually finding a door that led to a large hallway. He and Jacopo began searching the building room by room. They ran into a few other rats and roaches in the kitchen, munching a loaf of bread. They found a weapons room full of the standard issue swords, as well as crossbows and even a few wands. And finally, they found a series of small offices near where the front office would be. In one of them, the light was still on. Dantes had a feeling that was the exact one they needed to search. He and Jacopo moved toward the lit room, finding the door to be just slightly ajar. They scurried inside and saw Pasha at a desk, writing. The desk was standard, and the office layout was the exact same as all of the other offices were, with a desk in the center, one chair behind it, and two in front of it. There is a series of shelves across one of the walls filled with papers, and a small enchanted shell on the desk meant to communicate or receive communications from others who possessed one. While the other offices were filled with small knickknacks, openly displayed pornography, sketches of loved ones, or other such materials, this one was bare of any ornamentation. The spare surfaces were filled with papers and documents. The shelf on the wall was meticulously organized, and one of the walls contained notes, pictures, and lines connecting them with red yarn, seemingly a way for the man to organize his thoughts. Dantes took a closer look at the board. It was hard to make out the top from where he was in the small office, but the bottom corner he could make out contained gang members and leaders Dantes recognized from before had been thrown into the pit. The sketches of the leaders were familiar, with the majority of them having been crossed out, and the few that were left connected with string leading up the board higher. Dantes risked moving toward the center of the room. He expected to see a sketch of Mondego at the top, but was stunned to instead see Councilman Argena at the very top. Mondego and the string that connected to him were all the way on the bottom left corner, taking up only an eighth of the wall. This guard wasn't just trying to clean up Midtown. He was trying to clean up the entire city of Rendhold. In Dantes' mind, that made him a complete fucking lunatic. He was also a surprisingly good artist, as all of the sketches were incredibly well done. "Fucking rats," said Pasha, noticing him and throwing a paperweight in his direction that he narrowly dodged. Dantes scurried out of the room and took cover in a small gap between the floor and the wall in a nearby office. He wanted to go through what Pasha had thoroughly, and he wouldn't be able to do that as a rat, particularly not while the man was in there himself. That meant he would need to wait until he left. Jacopo grew immediately impatient and wandered back toward the kitchen. Dantes stayed there for an hour, listening to the soft writing of a pen the entire time before he decided that he too was getting bored, and there was no reason to sit idly and wait for the man to leave at novel Bennett at. He began exploring the other offices more thoroughly, shifting back into being a human long enough to pocket the odd petty coins that the higher-ranking guards kept in their offices. He had to stop himself from pocketing a few bottles of rye and some food they had left over. Those things may have been a hot commodity down in the Underprison, but on the surface they didn't have the same kind of value. He did find a confiscated wand, one man's wedding ring that had clearly been tossed at a wall in anger, and a small store of weed in one of the desks. In other cities had heard that illegal goods that were found were often stored in large warehouses for long periods of time. But in Rendhold, confiscated goods were almost immediately sold to merchants in lots for resale, with the city pocketing both the profits of that sale and the taxes that were collected when the merchants themselves sold the goods. Except for in the case of dust, which was either burned or went mysteriously missing. Dantes wished the Rendhold guard stored things that way. He shifted back into rat form and slid back out into the office hall, moving toward Pasha's office. It was nearly midnight, and the man was just leaving the office, sliding a key into the keyhole and locking the door. Dantes approached the door and moved to slide underneath the door as he had the others, but found that he couldn't. The door was differently sized than the others. He looked back at them and noticed that none of the others had locks either. That was interesting. He looked around and saw no one. So he shifted back into his human form, sliding the makeshift lockpicks from the prison in the door. It wasn't a complicated lock, and he heard the satisfying click of it opening after only a moment. He pushed his way inside slowly, keeping his senses focused particularly on the tips of his fingers, as if started to tingle, as that would indicate a magical alarm or ward of some kind, but there was no such thing. He closed the door and relit the candle that had just started its well-earned rest on the desk. The wall that had been covered with information was now obscured by a cloth. Dantes slid it to the side. Names, ranks, places, all of it was there on the wall. Dantes crouched down and began taking everything he wanted from the corner with connections to Mondego. Notes, pictures, all of it. He kept it organized in a neat pile as he worked. Once he was done, he went through the desk and the shelves for anything else that looked relevant and shoved all of it into his pack. He also helped himself to a fine stiletto with a clean black handle and its sheath. Once he was done collecting what he wanted, he tore down everything that was on the wall, scattered all the papers from the shelves, and carved stop or else into the desk. It was quick and dirty, but for a highly focused guard, he thought it was a solid provocation that could only help his own purposes. He shifted back into a rat and called for Jacopo to meet him back at the same window. They reached it without trouble and landed on wet streets, running their small paws through puddles on their way back to the docks. It was very late when Dantes made it back to the Vixen, but not so late that it had closed for the night. He shifted back into his normal self in an alley a few blocks away. It took longer than it had the last few times and was more painful. When it was over, he collapsed, breathing heavily with sweat dripping across his body. That was the longest time Head been in rat form, and apparently it came with consequences. He took a quarter hour to steady himself, but when he stood, it was on shaky legs that took another 10 minutes to calm. When he felt ready, he exited the alley with Jacopo comfortably in his pocket. The street was busy with sailors and drinkers lining it and having a bawdy time. A bard was singing the old "What Do You Do with a Captain's Daughter" song, though Head added in a few very creative lyrics to the mix, which a small crowd seemed to be truly transfixed by. Dantes walked into the Vixen to see Decker and one of the whores he hadn't yet met. A broad-shouldered girl with a plain face that was made striking by bright purple hair that fell in waves down past her shoulders. She had to have some kind of gnome or fae in her somewhere up the line, but aside from the hair, there was no other indication that she wasn't human. "Hello, sir," she said with an awkward curtsy. Dantes held up a hand. "You can save that. I'm not a customer. I'm Ver's guest, Ed." She nodded. "Oh, that's right. Sorry. It's fine. You don't have to apologize." "Oh, sorry." Dantes stopped himself from reiterating and just gave her a small smile before sliding past her and making his way to the bar, exchanging a nod with Decker as he moved. Zilly was sliding a tray of drinks toward what looked to be a first mate that took the platter and made his way toward where his captain and the other officers were seated with what looked to be the majority of the Vixen's employees. "They're pirates. They captured a Viscent steam galleon," said Zilly as he approached her, predicting his question before he even asked it. Dantes raised an eyebrow. "They captured one?" Steam galleons were the Viscent's prized vessels. Massive military vessels that could move without wind and cut through the seas like a knife. Had seen only one. Its black hull lined with cannons had left a distinct impression on him. He looked back over at the patrons. They were clean for pirates, clearly organized, but the idea of them capturing a steam galleon was hard to process, at it novel been at. I'm guessing the city bought it? Zilly nodded. Dantes frowned. It was the city's policy that they purchased captured vessels, both from legal and illegal privateers, in order to maintain the strength of its own navy. A lack of raw materials aside from the lumber outside the city's borders made that a near necessity. In this case, it seemed short-sighted. The Vicent weren't exactly friendly to begin with, and buying their vessel didn't seem like the best idea still. The city had managed to avoid war for more than a millennia, and the pirates' profits were the Vixen's gain, so he chose not to concern himself with it. What food's in the back? Clam soup, bread that's starting to go, and crab. A bowl of soup, some bread, and some of whatever bottle of wine Decker had you open for him earlier today. Zilly nodded, and poured him a glass, then went back into the kitchen, returning with a bowl of steaming soup with a torn-off hunk of bread on the side. Dantes started by tearing a piece of the bread and using it to sop up the rich red broth before eating it and washing it down with the wine. Warmth spread through him as he chewed and swallowed it, and he took a moment to close his eyes and thank the lady of the hearth. He wouldn't be taking good meals for granted anytime soon. He slipped a full clamshell into his coat for Jacopo before attacking the meal with gusto. His body craved the energy that the food gave him, and it wasn't until after his second bowl that his mind was able to concentrate on anything other than the food that was in front of him. Stolen content alert. This content belongs on Royal Road. Report any occurrences. He reflected on his day. Attacked by a strange growling man at the Vixen, attacked by 3 men at the docks, and robbing the guard. A very full, but overall successful day. He could have done without the attacks on him, but only one of them was really the result of his own actions, so he took that as a wash overall. His mind drifted to the dead Leviathan. Would it be possible for him to curry favor with something like that? It wasn't exactly like he could feed it. In fact, he was fairly certain that no one even knew what they ate. Could he curry favor with them by destroying a hunter, one of the boats they tracked and killed before bringing them back to process? Or would that be too indirect? Even if he did have the favor of a Leviathan god, what exactly would he do with it? And would the market granted him just swallow him whole, leaving all of his skin looking like it was tattooed? He ate one more bowl and had another glass of wine. The purple-haired girl sat next to him and made an awkward attempt at a sultry lean against the bar facing him. It looks like the Vixen is at last call, she said. Dantes looked around and saw the sailors finally pairing off and heading up to the girls' rooms. Looks like it. He slid his food towards Zilly, along with a silver as a tip. Alessa said that you helped her out the other day. Dantes nodded, taking her meaning immediately and glancing at Alessa, who blew him a teasing kiss that ended in a light cough. What's your name? Caressa. Dantes nodded. That was one of the fakest names Head ever heard. He sighed. He really needed to go through all of the information Head stolen and start coming up with a more firm plan. He needed to stay focused. Well, I've always thought of myself as the charitable sort. He gave her a wolfish grin, his willpower weakened by a long day of effort. It was going to take some time to make up for 5 years. There was no reason not to enjoy what Head missed in the midst of getting revenge for missing it. Dantes stood over his pack and began removing everything Head stolen from Pasha and laying it carefully out on the floor. Head sent Caressa back to her room with some silver and a bit of advice on leaning into her lack of experience rather than pretending to be something she wasn't. Shed seemed to be receptive, but he had a feeling Vera had likely given her the same advice, so who knew if it would take. Had been careful when Head taken the documents to make sure that they were sorted in such a way that he knew how to lay them back out. He started with the picture of Mondego, then came the picture of Mercedes, then he got a people he didn't know as well. They were a motley mix of orcs, dwarves, mutts, and even a few elves all scattered below him, and then mostly more mutts at the very bottom. He recognized a few as old gang heads who Mondego must have subjugated somehow, and below them were some other familiar faces. The majority of them near Mondego himself were brand new though, younger for what he could tell. He kept pulling out notes and pictures, and stopped when he reached a face he didn't recognize. It was familiar. Dark-haired mutt with average features, his gray skin shaded in with charcoal. Between broad and skinny, with the eyes kept light. He flipped over the picture to see the name Dantes written on it. He frowned. Had Bashaw seen him at some point, or if it was the sketch based on what other people had said of how he looked? He searched for the corresponding notes. Dantes, orc, elf, human dwarf. Former leader of Mondago's old gang. Currently in Underprison. Minor player, but sources indicate he is mentioned frequently by Mondago. Request input to have him located for questioning in the Underprison. Minor player, huh? Well, not for long. Though he once again wondered why Mondago was still mentioning him at all. He had paid to have the consortium not help him to escape and to keep him from communicating with the outside, and now this? It didn't make any sense. When you have someone thrown into a hole with no way out, the point is to never have to think about them again. He went through the rest of the notes, finding one near the bottom for Danglars, and below, even that one he found Gaspard. Gaspard, orc, elf, halfling, favors halfling. Cutthroat, formerly in Mondago's gang. No mentions. Has been beaten attempting to speak to Mondago. Currently in hiding for killing a young woman in Uptown. Asked the investigation to let me speak with him if he was found. Below that was a list of common haunts that Gaspard frequented. That gave Dantes places to monitor. There was a possibility that he had left the city, but that was unlikely. Just like Dantes, he was a Midtowner born and raised. He didn't know anything else. Dantes came down early in the morning as he had the previous day, creeping completely silently down the stairs and arriving to the side of Tilly once again cleaning the floors. She was a very orderly sort. Had noticed how immaculate she kept her bar, and everything in the Vixen seemed to run on a schedule she set. Her ear twitched as Dantes arrived. She stopped her mopping and gestured for him to follow her. He raised an eyebrow, but complied, pausing only to slip off his boots so that he wouldn't dirty the freshly mopped floors. He met her in the kitchen, where she seemed to be preparing another simple and portable breakfast for him. He waited patiently, watching her work. She was graceful, grabbing certain items without even looking at them, and tying up the food in a cloth napkin with a kind of simple grace he found captivating. He held out an expectant hand, but she just looked at him for a moment. Her gaze was neutral. You came back yesterday with a much heavier pack than you left with. He shrugged. Had to buy a few things. How does a deckhand afford to hire a whore at full price every night? I'd been saving for quite some time. I did my best to avoid the vices of gambling while at sea, unlike my fellow sailors. I haven't known many men who avoid gambling, but engage freely in whoring. He smiled. I didn't say I avoided all vices, just gambling and even that, just at sea. Did you hear about the recent prison escapes? I started hearing about it the day after you showed up. I've always had shit timing come back to my home city for the first time in 5 years, and all of a sudden the underprison has a breakout. Tillis' eyebrow twitched. She clearly wasn't buying a word he was saying. She handed him a napkin of food anyway. You're dangerous, I can tell. Vera wants you here, and I won't go against her. But if you care about her in the way she does for you, then you should leave as soon as you can. And here I thought you were paying attention to me for other reasons. You're too short for me. At novel been at. He laughed. I've heard a number of women say that to me over the years. I've always been a climber, though. Most of them come around. Her mouth almost twitched into a smile, but she kept her neutral expression up. And not most women. True, that I could tell right away. He took her napkin and dropped his wry smile for a more serious expression. I don't intend to be here too long. Maybe a month. I'll do what I can to make sure any trouble I cause doesn't come to the Vixen or Vera. You have my word for whatever that's worth. He meant it. He didn't want a repeat of what had happened with Tell. She nodded, surprised at his brief sincerity. He smiled again. Thank you for the food. I'll be back for breakfast. Then he walked out of the building and began heading for his new garden. The next several weeks, Dantes fell into a familiar pattern. He'd wake up early to go and tend his garden, which was growing far quicker than was normal, but also slower than his blood garden had developed. Still, hearing pleas for more water, or shade, or fertilizer were a lot easier to deal with than screams for blood. Since he couldn't rely on speed, he decided to focus on scale. He bought fruits and vegetables from vendors all over the city, feeding himself, rats, roaches, and whatever else was interesting, and then taking the time to plant the seeds. He found 3 more sealed sections and began to tend to them as well. It took less time to maintain with each visit, and he eventually began to see and feel new threads between himself and those gardens that grew stronger with each day. They still paled in comparison to the thick strand that connected him to the underprison, but it was progress, and he started to see the first signs of fruit after only 2 weeks, which he immediately began offering to whatever nearby animals were interested. He also gifted Vera and the vixen a number of flower boxes for each of the windows, all of which seemed to flourish and produce sublime fragrance due to his presence. Pleasant smells were a good thing to keep around a whorehouse. This story has been stolen from Royal Road. If you read it on Amazon, please report it. His only disappointment had been his inability to grow weed. Every time he acquired a seed or two, he'd take them to his garden and find them much too picky to plant. They seemed to have incredibly specific care needs, which likely explained why most of those had known who grew them seemed to need to focus so much on their care. Still, Dantes saved the seeds with the hope that he'd eventually have whatever insight he required to grow them. After he tended his gardens, had arrived back at the Vixen for breakfast with Vera and the girls, then he'd act as the bouncer until late afternoon when Decker arrived, typically in a sour mood. He would listen to the different sailors talk about how much this country or that pissed them off, or about how Rendhold would need to choose a side eventually in attempts to sound intelligent and impress women who cared far more for the coin jingling in their pockets than anything rattling around in their skulls. He'd sometimes need to rough someone up or calm someone down, but overall the early shift wasn't a lot of trouble, and he could follow along as Jacopo enjoyed his time in the city feeding, fighting, and fucking, though the third thing he tuned out. In the evenings he would go through the city in rat form with Jacopo, verifying the people, places, and deals that Pasha had put together in his report. He found gambling dens, warehouses for storing illegal goods, corpse disposers, guardsmen had paid off, hideouts, sub-bosses. Pasha was good at his job, and that made things all that much easier for Dantes. He also attempted to infiltrate Mercedes and Mondiego's home, but found that it had been enchanted to block out vermin. He saw Mercedes leave the home only once, and never saw Mondego leave, though a number of the men in his employ frequented the building, often with chests full of his cut of all the profit that flowed in and out of Midtown. The more information he had, and the more favor he had, the easier it would be to start taking bites out of Mondego's fledgling empire. He'd need other resources, and maybe even some muscle, but nothing beat intelligence on the enemy. With at least a marginal flow of favor in place, he sent rats to monitor Gaspert's haunts as indicated by Pasha's information. He had no hits so far, but he was sure he'd find him eventually. He wasn't smart enough to stay hidden forever. The last thing he did every night was return his first garden a second time. He employed the same technique he'd been using in the pit before he'd escaped. He'd light a number of candles one by one using telephone's finger and broadcast images of light to nearby moths and other insects. They would move toward the light, and once enough were gathered he'd let the bats know that an easy meal was available. Once they were well into their meal, he'd depart and head back to the Vixen for dinner, and head in the day spend the night with whichever woman, or in some cases, women who hadn't had as much luck with their clients that they'd have preferred. It was a true chore for him, but he persevered somehow. Dantes felt the tight press of warm bodies around him, and for a moment wondered how Tyra could be surrounding him from all sides. He shook his head. It was dark, and he could hear a light chittering all around him. Eventually he found himself able to understand small snippets of it. Roost too close to the entrance. Fruit. Blood takes too much to fill up. Meet again soon. He looked around, but couldn't make out any specific features of what was surrounding him, only that it was warm and, for the most part, comfortable. He tilted his head up and realized that the ground was above him somehow. He blinked twice, trying to make sense of it. While he was pondering the floor, the chittering suddenly ceased and left behind a silence that was hungry for words. He felt movement and could feel a parting of all of the warm bodies near him as something else approached. Waves of something beat against him gently, like an unsteady breeze, as something located and approached him. He felt cold and alone for a moment, and then Suddenly, a massive black shape flipped itself right side up, its feet grasping a piece of cave wall in front of him, and its enormous black wings folding around its body like a cloak. "Hello, Dantes," said the bat god. Its voice was fine and clear, but for some reason it made his ears ring as he heard it. "You've heard of me? My brother indicated to me that you may pay me a visit soon. I admit, ID thought it would be sooner than your visit to the roaches, but I suppose it makes sense for you to work your way up the food chain. I simply wanted to show the proper deference," managed Dantes, picking up on the bat's oddly noble method of speech. He gave a low, satisfied hum. "As it should be. Blessings from me to your kind are rare. Many of them move straight to that which seems the most powerful rather than the most useful. Now vampires and warlocks. They have the good taste to request my blessing early and often. I apologize for the short-sightedness of my brethren." The bat god bent down and leaned in close. His teeth were tiny in his mouth, but razor-shaped, and his eyes were a bright and maddening yellow. "Be careful. You don't want to take responsibility for a group you don't truly know." Dantes nodded. "Wise." The bat god straightened himself out. "Before I give you this blessing, you should know that it is largely due to my brother that you are receiving it. You will not always be able to receive a blessing simply by feeding a god's children. Many of us are pickier than that." Dantes hadn't considered that, but it made sense. Had even noticed that the gains he received from the rats and roaches had increased when his garden was completed, even when they didn't seem to be actively eating. "I appreciate your generosity. You say that now." He lifted his wings and encircled Dantes with them, plunging him into total darkness. He felt a sense of complete nothingness for just a moment, and then a searing pain in arm. He tried to pull it away, but the darkness around him seemed tangible and held him in place. He felt the blood flowing from his arm and into whatever was causing the pain. He struggled and fought, but his resistance grew weaker and weaker until he thought he had nothing left. Then he woke up. Dantes shot up, breathing heavily and covered in sweat. He looked around the room, sensed the flowers on his windowsill, Jacopo stirring beneath the bed, and a solitary roach nibbling on some small crumbs he must spilled as head snacked. Tyra gave him a light kick with a short but shapely leg before turning back over and swiftly returning to heavy snoring. He silently left the bed and navigated to the bowl and mirror at the far end of the room. He took a small cloth, soaked it in cold water, and pressed it against his face for nearly a full minute. He removed it, letting out a deep breath, and looked at his wrist. A few inches above his roach mark were 2 bat wings, which were segmented into 3 pieces each. One of those segments was filled in completely with gold. Below that, his rat and roach marks were roughly half full. He ran his fingers along the raised skin of each mark. Words, gold, violence, those used to be the only tools at his disposal. They were enough more often than not, but his druid ability's real, tangible power, that was something to be grateful for. He found himself muttering a short prayer to the mother. Something had heard some woman mutter while he passed her watering some flowers years and years ago. The dirt, the seed, the mother. The life, the growth, the mother. The withering, the rebirth, the mother. "You talking to yourself over there?" asked Tyra as she stretched and yawned. "I know the weed we shared was strong, but if it makes you talk to yourself, I'll keep it to myself next time, Eddie." Dantes chucked. "I think the real trick would be to let me smoke more so that I get used to it." She smiled and pulled a pipe from somewhere within the curls of her hair, and some weed from the pile of clothes shed left by the bed. "I mean, I don't mind having an excuse to start the day right." He grabbed Telephone's finger from a nightstand and lit her pipe while she took a long inhale. He smiled. Tel would have definitely appreciated being used in this situation. Dantes went about his usual business after that, tending his gardens before returning to man the door at the Vixen until Decker arrived. He ate a particularly robust breakfast, which between the smell that radiated off of him and the slight red tinge to his eyes, drew him some judgmental glares from Vera. He gave her a wide smile back in return. He certainly remembered her smoking more than her fair share of what was then referred to as delirium's delight, but he decided not to bring that up in her house. Once he was done, he fell back into his usual routine as a bouncer. Shifting his focus between Jacopo and the rats, he had watching Gaspard's old haunts. In the middle of a particularly slow hour, his hunt bore fruit. He was older and far rougher than Dantes remembered. His dark brown hair had spots of gray, and his boyish halfling features seemed to have given way to a fresh batch of wrinkles. His clothing was dirty and full of holes, but that was nothing new. Even when they'd made money from a job, he'd always preferred to spend it on booze, dust, women, and weed rather than anything more permanent. His eyes darted back and forth as he approached the Drowned Rat, an aptly named bar in a low part of Midtown near the docks that flooded every typhoon season. Gaspard looked like shit, reeked of fear and desperation, and didn't even know that at that moment his death was sealed. Dantes broke contact with the other rats he was using to monitor Gaspard's other possible locations and focused his attention on that one, willing the rat to follow Gaspard inside. Gaspard pushed open the front door slowly and assessed the bar. There were a few people passed out in pools of their own filth, and the bartender himself sipped straight from a bottle as he plucked on a small, out-of-tune loot. He saw a rat run in behind him and attempted to kick it, but missed and could swear the damned thing made a rude gesture as it ran under a table. Unauthorized duplication. This tale has been taken without consent. Report sightings. Gaspard sat in front of the bartender, still glancing right and left, as if a guard would suddenly appear to throw him directly into the pit. "Want some booze?" asked the bartender, not looking up from his loot as he spoke. Yeah. Whatever you have that's strong and cheap. That's everything here, man." The bartender looked up from his loot and raised his eyebrows. "Oh shit, Gaspard. It's been a while, you piece of shit. Where have you been?" He took a dirty glass from under the bar and filled it with something brown and strong. "Just laying low." The bartender placed the drink in front of himself, but didn't slide it forward. Gaspard gave him a look. "Come on. We both know I can't have a tab for you. You're a fucking dead man." Gaspard ran a shaking hand through his hair and pulled 2 copper from one of his pockets. The bartender took the coin and slid the booze over to him. Gaspard drank the entire glass in a single motion, then slid another 2 coins toward the bartender for another. The bartender shook his head as he poured. "Killing a highborn woman. Bad fucking idea, man." Gaspard swiped the full glass from the bartender, spilling a good third of it, and threw it back. When he was done, he wiped his face with the dirty sleeve of his jacket. "I fucking know that. I had a scam. A really fucking good one. It wasn't supposed to go that way. I was finally gonna be fucking rich." "Oh yeah?" "Yeah. I got a few different young noblemen to hire me. I'd scare the woman they wanted a court, maybe steal a bit of jewelry, and they'd swoop in and save them. I'd earn a few gold, not to mention what I stole, and they'd get a better chance at getting some highborn skirt. At it novel been at. Guess it didn't go right that last time." Gaspard slid more copper his way. "No. She fucking struggled, the dumb bitch. Basically fell into my knife. All 20 times. Well, the first one was her fault. Who gives a shit about the next 16? 19. Whatever." He slid more coin across the bar and slammed another drink, his nerves seeming to calm as he stopped looking left and right fearfully. The bartender served him a few more drinks and gave him some gruel, so, while looking at Dantes, was sure that feeding it to the rats would cost him favor rather than gain it for him. Once he was done eating, the bartender spoke one more time. "You probably want to clear out before the main crowd gets here. There's a bounty out for you. Those knuckle-draggers will sell you out the moment they see you." Gaspard nodded. "Yeah, good idea. Thanks, Bearton. No problem. You've always been a good customer. Come back tomorrow at this same time. They'll feed you again." Gaspard pushed himself away from the bar and nearly fell off his stool. He steadied himself and walked slowly out and back onto the streets. The rat Dantes had been controlling wasn't quick enough to follow Gaspard out, so he switched his focus to a different one that had moved to monitor the outside of the Drowned Rat and had it follow Gaspard. In the midst of that, the bartender moved to one of the passed-out regulars and gave him a firm kick to the ribs. "You want free booze for the night?" The man, bleary-eyed and unfocused as he was, still managed a desperate nodding to the question. "Go down to the Midtown guard station and tell the guard there, Pasha, to meet me here." Dantes broke his connection to that rat. Bearton was going to sell out Gaspard for the bounty. He seemed like a clever sort. Dantes made a mental note to remember that as he watched Gaspard slowly slink through the emptiest streets and alleys possible until he reached a seemingly abandoned building. He moved some board in front of it upward and crawled through a window. Dantes had the rat follow him. Inside, Gaspard drunkenly stumbled through a few dusty rooms filled with broken furniture before collapsing on a dirty old mattress in the corner, next to which was a half-used candle and a small bag. He quickly passed out. Dantes smiled, his heart pounding. He had him. One of those that had betrayed him was within his grasp. As long as he struck that night, he'd have him long before Pasha had any idea that had missed him. "Why are you smiling?" asked Sarah with a raised eyebrow. She was manning the door as she waited on a client. "Oh, I just thought of a funny joke." Sarah looked like she wouldn't bite for a moment. Then she let out a sigh when after another minute no one had walked through the door. "What's the joke?" He chuckled. "Well, a dwarven priest, an Orcish carpenter, and a gnome sailor walk into a whorehouse early in the morning. And so the gnome sailor says to the orc, 'I've never seen a man firmer in his beliefs.'" Finished Dantes with a smile. Sarah's face contorted as she tried to resist laughing, but holding it back just meant that it came out with a loud snort that drew the stares of people nearby. "That's a terrible joke." "That's what makes it funny," replied Dantes with his mind's eye still watching Gaspard drunkenly sleep. "I learned that joke from Vera, actually. Heard her telling it when she thought I wasn't listening." "Really?" "I can't picture her telling a joke. A wry observation maybe, but not a joke." "You just haven't seen her drunk enough then." Sarah raised her eyebrows and prepared to ask more questions when a large man in a dark red Timon naval officer's uniform, along with the requisite mustache, walked into the vixen. She swiftly amended her expression to something a little haughty, and he immediately asked to share a drink with her. The rest of the afternoon went by with little issue for the vixen, which let Dantes obsessively watch Gaspard as he stood at the door, nearly vibrating with anticipation. The girls left him mostly alone as they swapped who manned the door with him. Usually they'd make small talk, or even flirt a bit, but they could tell his focus was elsewhere and saw fit to give him his space. Deckard didn't arrive at the vixen until the sun was setting. He had a tired and miserable expression on his face, but this time Dantes ignored it, not letting him get his customary drink and instead quickly collecting supplies from his room, before collecting Jacopo in a nearby alley. Gaspard had started to stir in his sleep, and the building he was in would take more than an hour to reach by foot or paw. He walked toward his destination until he was as close to Midtown as he was willing to risk as a human. He no longer felt any agitation at the large milling crowds in Rendhold streets, and that day he didn't even see them. He simply moved, and the crowd parted from him almost instinctively, knowing danger when they saw it. "This one will bleed today?" asked Jacopo, peering through the same rat's mind that Dantes was looking through. "Oh yes. No taking away from him? No complications? At it, novel Benedet. He doesn't have anything to take, except his life. The only thing he might offer to delay losing, that is information on the others." "Good. Some sense." Finally, muttered Jacopo mentally. Whether he meant good sense to the world at large or from Dantes himself, he didn't take the time to consider. At the edge of Midtown, Dantes shifted into the form of a rat and continued on his way. The pace was much slower than he wanted, but being recognized could cost him far more time. Gaspard finally woke up once Dantes was just under a mile away. He rubbed his bloodshot eyes and dragged himself to a bucket in the corner to vomit before swishing some water from a clear bottle and spitting it on the ground. He dragged himself to his bag, then did a bump of dust, smacking himself in the face a few times to perk up. After that he laid on his dirty mattress and stared at the ceiling for a while, sipping occasionally from his water bottle and muttering curses, promises, and prayers under his breath. Dantes recognized that state. It reminded him of how had been when had first arrived in the pit, staying in a fugue state of alcohol and dust for as long as he possibly could, scraping by on favors and violence, falling asleep in pools of his own filth. He felt immense satisfaction seeing Gaspard that way. He looked forward to making him feel even worse. Unauthorized duplication. This tale has been taken without consent. Reports sightings. He and Jacopo reached Gaspard's den shortly after nightfall. The moon was shining full and beautiful in the sky, not hidden by the streetlights lit by academy students. as bringing them to this part of the city would be far too dangerous. It was an old 3-story slum house. The brick it had been built of had long before started to wear down, with thick cracks lining each wall. Between those cracks, Dantes could sense rats and roaches, who he began to rally and organize. The smell of rot and decay emanated from within the building, and Dantes slipped in as a rat next to Jacopo. Once he was inside, he shifted back to human form and began placing his vermin strategically around the room. He pulled down his hood and stepped into the room where Gaspard was lamenting his fate. He was so in the throes of his despair that it took him nearly a full minute to see Dantes looming at the end of the room, his golden eyes glinting in the light of the nearly melted candle by Gaspard's bed. He started breathing quickly, sitting up quickly, and rubbing his eyes before blinking and looking at the water bottle next to him, as if wondering if Head accidentally spiked himself. "I'm afraid I'm very real." "What the fuck?" said Gaspard, pushing himself up the wall and bringing himself to his feet, his eyes wide with fear. Dantes raised his hands. "Oh no, don't be afraid, old friend. I'm just here for a chat," he lied, a smile on his face. "Really?" "Yes, just a chat. After that I'll leave you be." Gaspard almost believed him, the tension beginning to leave his body before it snapped back into him. "I'm not nearly drunk or high enough to believe that." Dantes lunged for him. He kept his dagger at his waist. Gaspard was the only one of the gang that had been smaller than him, and he was confident he could overpower him, particularly now. Unfortunately, Gaspard had a trick up his sleeve. Out of it, he pulled a wand which he quickly sent his will through as he aimed it at Dantes. Dantes threw himself to the side the last moment, and a ball of white energy blasted past him before hitting the brick wall behind him and launching both of them with concussive force. "Fuck," muttered Dantes as he stood up and looked for Gaspard in the haze of dust and debris the wand had kicked up. He heard him bolt up the stairs, and then stillness. He cast his focus to a rat head already placed there, and saw Gaspard sitting at the top of the creaky steps with the wand pointed downward. "Where'd you find a thing like that?" yelled Dantes from below, before he shifted into rat form and moved into a hole in the wall, where he began climbing upward. Did a job for an academy graduate. Pushed a rival of his off a high balcony. I've got plenty of charges on it to burn through, too. Dantes reached the second floor and shifted back into human form, creeping up behind him. He had rats make some additional noise near the bottom of the stairs to help mask his movements. Gaspard couldn't hear him. He could only hear his heart beating in his ears, and small bits of debris in his eyes were making it hard to see for him as well. Dantes lunged at him from behind, grabbing the arm that held the wand as he did so. Gaspard loosed another blast on the ceiling, but Dantes kept his grip strong, and when they landed on the ground, he slammed Gaspard's hand on the floor again and again until he released the wand which Dantes brushed away. Wait, yelled Gaspard as Dantes threw him into the wall. "Please, he'll tell you anything." Dantes' fist hit his gut with enough force that he was thrown into the old brick wall behind him, and a cloud of dust came off of it. Everything went red. For a few moments, all of Dantes' plans, questions, and focus on the vermin around him dropped completely. He was all muscle, rage, and brutality, and he rained down blows on Gaspard like a typhoon. Dantes barely managed to hold himself back from killing him, but when Head stopped, Gaspard had spat up blood and teeth. His face was a swollen and red mess, and his body had kept him mercilessly conscious. Dantes breathed heavily. His fists were covered in small cuts, and the bones in his knuckles felt as if they'd cracked. The building groaned, as if the fight had been too much for its old frame to handle. Dantes grabbed Gaspard by leg and started to drag him downstairs. Gaspard groaned as he bounced on them one by one. Dantes grabbed his bag and then dragged him out into the alley. A light rain was falling, and Dantes pulled up his hood before he started to move down the alley, deeper into the dilapidated square of Midtown in which Head found himself. The building they were in had been falling apart, and they made a lot of noise that might attract people, so he needed to move Gaspard to a second location. He looked at Gaspard's battered form and noted that he was finally unconscious. Jacopo rode on his chest, watching him for signs of struggle. "You go ahead and nap for now, Gaspard. We'll get you to your second location soon." Gaspard woke in the dark, and for a moment, he wondered if he was dead. He didn't feel any pain, which was a stark contrast to how he felt when had finally passed out. How he felt while Dantes was striking him. He tried to move and found that he couldn't. The feeling of ropes on his arms and legs straining against him helped him to realize that no, he wasn't dead. A single flame appeared at the end of a finger of bone and descended in front of him onto the tip of a candle that took to the flame easily, illuminating Dantes' dark form in the middle of a room almost danker than the one that Gaspard had just been sleeping in. "I was worried you wouldn't wake up for a moment there. Good thing you had that potion I could pour down your throat." Gaspard cursed under his breath. That's why he wasn't in pain anymore. "What do you want? Going to beat me near to death again?" "Possibly. I have some questions I need answered first." "Why would I do that?" "You're just going to kill me anyway." Dantes let out a cruel laugh. "You think you're worth that effort?" "No. I have a contact on a Frashiid ship. Deals in slaves. I told him I could haul you in and sell you as an unmarked slave, no questions asked. Even offer me some coins since they're below quota." Dantes was lying, but he savored the fear on Gaspard's face as he spoke. "Or I could turn you into the guard. The pit is better than being a Frashiid slave. Hell, at least you can still get dust down there. It all depends on how you cooperate." Gaspard tested his ropes again, trying to be subtle, but they didn't budge. Dantes had always been an expert with knots, so he wasn't surprised. "Fine, ask your fucking questions, you piece of shit." Dantes stepped toward him and gave him a light slap on the face. "They're the good little halfling." He leaned back and sat on a chair across from Gaspard, leaning just far enough that his face was lit by candlelight. "My first question is why?" Gaspard swallowed. "Why? Dantes' glare stopped him from asking the obviously stupid question. "Listen, man, it wasn't my idea. It wasn't anyone's idea. After the job with the Dock Shark's safe house, when you went to hide some of the haul for later, and the rest of us went out to celebrate, you remember that?" Dantes grimaced. He remembered sneaking away to be alone with a brick of dust he didn't want to share. "Yes, I do. We were hanging out, just smoking, drinking at the Middle Child, the tavern." Dantes nodded. "Get the fuck on with it. We got a weird fucking invitation. It had real gold on the edges and everything. A man in black gave it to us. On it was directions." Dantes stayed quiet. Gaspard was a good liar. If he wanted to make something up, he'd have been able to come up with something much more believable than what he was saying. "We followed them. Not sure why, but I personally couldn't even bear to take my hand to the invitation. It was like it had a hold of my soul." Gaspard paused to lick his lips. He was staring at the flickering candle as he spoke, almost as if he was watching the memory play out in the flame. "We arrived at a building near the Temple of the Many Gods. It was unmarked. When we went inside, there was a man there alone. His face, it was made of gold. Like a mask? The narrative has been taken without authorization. If you see it on Amazon, report the incident." "No, it moved like skin. I could see a gold tongue in his mouth moving when he spoke to us. He offered us a deal. We need to make a sacrifice, the larger the better, and in return we could have everything we desired as long as gold flowed to him." Dantes leaned further forward in his chair, realization hitting him. "I was the sacrifice." "Yeah, and he was the one to suggest it. His words, they had a rhythm to them. Like you could listen to them forever." "How did he know me? Had it novel been at?" Gaspard shook his head. "It wasn't about you. Hells, it wasn't about me. It was about Mondego, Mercedes, and Danglars. He saw something in them, and the minute that he made the offer, any resistance they might have had to it crumbled with only faint protests. None of them spoke up. Not when you questioned it." Gaspard laughed, cruelty dripping from the tone of it despite his situation. "What? You think we all loved you? Do you really not know what you're like? How bad you were after your mom died?" Dantes stayed silent. "You had us take insane risks. Jobs we never would have tried if you hadn't been there driving us forward. You were high on dust all of the time that you paid for by skimming from our profits. It was not a high price to pay to get rid of you for the promise he offered." Dantes clenched his jaw, his small dusks drawing a bit of blood on the inside of his cheeks. "My mother had only been dead for a year. None of you ever said anything. None of you argued or disagreed with any of my plans. We were a crew, not a group of slaves. Any of you could have left whenever you wanted to. Dantes spoke calmly. You cost me 5 years of life, doomed me to a hole without light, because it was easier to listen to the honeyed words of a strange man than it was to confront me. He stood up from the chair. Wasn't my business to confront you. Mondego and your bitch should have done that. Dantes laughed. I'm guessing that's why your life is shit and theirs are great? Because getting rid of me wasn't a big sacrifice for you? Gaspard sneered. Probably. It'd thrown you in the pit for a handful of copper and a warm beer. Dantes backhanded him, but held back his full strength. Why didn't they kill me? There were chances both before and after I was in the pit. The man said it had to cut deeper than just death. They had to bring you to ruination, to take everything from you. Even hope had to be cleaved from your heart. He also said it had to be gamble or risk. His God enjoys a dangerous bet. His words, I assume? Gaspard spat out a bit of blood and nodded. What happened after that? Well, no one really committed to anything. We all thought we'd just think about it. Then the job with the carriage happened, and Mondego took the choice out of our hands. After that, we had another meeting with the guy. We all shook his hand, and the 3 of them were marked. Their left hands, a ring of gold around their middle finger. They have to offer to the god of greed to fill it, and they will continue to find their ambitions met and their desires fulfilled. At least that was what he told them. Dantes thought of the god marks on his own body and how they functioned, the blessings that they were. The only difference was that when his ran out, his luck wouldn't necessarily run out with them. For Mondego, Danglars, and Mercedes, he bet the consequences would be much more dire. His mother had warned him of the god of greed when he was younger. It was one of the few things she and his father had agreed on. The god of greed could grant tremendous blessings, but each time you made an offering to him, it needed to be greater than the last one. And when you were no longer able to make your commitments to him, and you found yourself skewered at the end of someone's blade, your soul would be his forever, to be counted like a coin, smelted into gold bars, or traded with the hells. You didn't receive a mark? He shook his head. No. The man simply gave me a pouch of gold and told me to help them along. I counted myself as the lucky one. Money in hand is always more valuable than vague promises. Apparently not in this case. Gaspard gave a frustrated groan in response. When was the last time you heard from any of them? I haven't seen Mondego or Mercedes for years. Last time we crossed paths, I asked for a loan, and they had me beaten. Greedy bastards. And Danglars? He got me out of some trouble when the guard caught me with some dust. He was always the only one of you all worth a damn. What about the man with the golden face? He shivered. No, and thank all the gods for that. Dantes stood there, looking at Gaspard for a few moments. Head reached the end of his questions. There was nothing else he could learn from him, no other information he could get. In front of him sat a mutt covered in his own dried blood and filth. There was no value in killing him. Even if he let him go, the guard would catch him shortly after. To go any further than he had would be meaningless. It would make us feel better, noted Jacopo, sensing his thoughts. Dante smiled. That it would. Dantes poured what was left of Gaspard's healing potion over his knuckles, wincing as the bones in them resealed and the scrapes stitched together. He pocketed the other 2 potions that were left over and patted the pocket head stored the wand Gaspard had used in. He couldn't tell exactly, but it felt as if it had maybe 2 charges left in it. Had also found a small handful of gold. Between all those goods, the satisfaction of killing Gaspard with his bare hands, and the information Head gained, Head say it had been a great evening overall. He returned to Gaspard's corpse, which was being devoured by rats and roaches. Only his face being left alone per Dante's request. Excuse me. The creatures parted at his warning as he grabbed a hold of the corpse and began dragging it through the house. He reached the front door and pushed it open to find that the slight drizzle had turned into a heavy downpour, thick dark clouds now obscuring the full moon Head been able to see earlier in the night. He appreciated the cover as he moved through the dark alleys until he reached the edge of a main street. It was clear, and the heavy rain was obscuring everyone's vision who might have been nearby. He tossed the body into the sidewalk and started walking back toward the vixen, the gears of his mind cranking. He wanted the body to be found. He hoped that between Gaspard's connection to Mondego and the damage Head caused to Pasha's office, He'd stir up some general trouble that He'd be able to find some use for. Not one of the few people out in the rain so much as glanced in his direction as he walked away from the corpse. Just another mutt with his hood up in Midtown. It was comforting, but he also missed the attention He'd received in the pit. The glances, whispers, and parting of crowds as he moved through them. He'd savored that and He'd tasted again. He walked through the streets until his jacket was nearly soaked through, Jacopo muttering light complaints of incoming water. He was nearly halfway back to the Vixen when he felt a chill climb up his spine. Every single hair on his body began to stand on end, and his heart began to beat more quickly as his breath quickened. There's a predator of some kind nearby, sent Jacopo, crawling to sit on his shoulder, his head poking out next to Dantes' own in the hood of his jacket. At it novel been at. A mugger, maybe? Some kind of street thug? No, something not human. Dantes was about to ask for clarification when a howl pierced the roar of the rain and shook him down to his soul. He looked around, with both his eyes and his senses. No one was on the side street he was walking through except for him, though he thought he saw a shifting shadow on a nearby rooftop, but it was gone before he could make sense of it. His other senses spread out gradually, and he quickly found that while there were still roaches aplenty, all of the smaller animals and birds were gone. He sent his senses out further and felt a sudden, intense pang in his chest, as if an icicle had been driven momentarily into his heart. He had to stop himself from breaking into a sprint and running. He took a deep breath and began to summon his will, sending roaches out in a search pattern from where he was as he walked. He started to gather rats and bats to rally to his aid as well, but he could feel a tangible resistance from them, as if their fear was overriding his will as he sent it to them. Still, he pushed and started to feel them approach. Before his roaches could find anything, the beast that was following him made itself known. Dantes heard rapid, wet footsteps approaching him from behind, and whirled around to the sight of a massive black shape in midair about to strike him. This content has been misappropriated from Royal Road. Report any instances of this story if found elsewhere. He was hit and flew backwards, skipping across the cobblestone street like a stone. He pulled his dagger from his belt and tried to stand, when a second creature, this time a dark gray, knocked him back down. Dantes had never seen wolves before. Dogs, certainly, strays lined the streets of Rendhold, but never wolves. Still, he had no doubt in his mind that's what he was facing. Dantes stayed down this time, reaching into one of his internal pockets as he pretended to be unable to stand. One of the wolves approached him cautiously, and once it was less than a yard away from him, he pointed just the tip of the wand head just looted from out from under himself and sent his will through it. A blast of white energy blasted the gray wolf. It barely managed to keep it from striking in the snout, taking the blow to the shoulder instead. Dantes rolled and stood up, aiming the wand at the other wolf and firing the last blast from it. Forewarned by what had happened to its companion, the black wolf dodged the blast nimbly before lunging for Dantes. With the wand drained, Dantes struck out with it wildly, managing to jam it in the wolf's mouth, stopping it before it could clamp its jaws down on him. Momentarily free of both wolves, he sent a surge of will through all of his marks, and sent everything he could at both of them. The rats, roaches, and bats that had been gathering all began swarming the wolves. Dantes' instincts were screaming at him to run while they were distracted, a kind of prey-like instinct in his gut telling him that fighting was a bad idea. He fought that down. The best way to address this problem would be to take care of it at that moment. He drew his dagger and ran to the nearest wolf. He found himself letting out a kind of roar as he charged. He buried the blade deep in the black wolf's haunches, and it let out a loud howl as dark blood began flowing from the wound. Dantes felt the moment that the favor in each of his marks all emptied at nearly the same time. Making the vermin attack something that they feared like the wolves clearly cost far more favor than even having them attack humans. Dantes left the dagger where it was and started running away with the rest of the vermin. He became a rat to quickly scale a nearby building and began leaping from rooftop to rooftop, Jacopo clinging to his shoulder as he moved. It was hard work, sopping wet, but since he was out of offensive options, escape had become the focus. He spared a few thoughts for why in the fuck he was being attacked by wolves in Midtown. They hadn't even given him a chance to communicate with them. He couldn't sense them, and now he was running from them for dear life. Was this something Head missed in the last 5 years? Were street wolves a new menace no one had bothered to warn him about? He heard howling and the heavy thumping of paws behind him. He risked a look back to see both wolves leaping from rooftop to rooftop behind him. The black one, whose leg Head stabbed just moments ago, seemed completely unharmed. He could feel himself getting exhausted. His limbs began to feel as if they were filled with lead, and he nearly slipped off of a particularly high rooftop. He pulled old shivs from each of his sleeves as he turned around on a particularly narrow rooftop. He'd make a stand on the edge. Only one wolf would be able to follow him one at a time, and if he could make it lose its footing, it would fall down and die in the alley below. He looked at the wolves and realized they'd stopped moving. Black and gray, obscure by the rain, the wolves simply stood there. They weren't looking at him, but rather the sky above him. He looked up to see the shape of a massive bird with a wickedly curved beak briefly silhouetted by a lightning strike. It dove toward him. He ducked just before it hit him and pulled up. When he looked behind himself where he expected to see it, in its place was a bear. Much like Wolf's head, never seen one in person, but he had seen one's head mounted at an inn. This one seemed much bigger. It was completely white, with black eyes that matched the sky behind it, and claws bigger than his head. Dantes held up the shivs defiantly. "You're druids, right?" The bear regarded him with pitch-black, unblinking eyes. "Why are you doing this?" The bear's eyes seemed to glow, and Dantes felt in his mind a single command from it. "Sleep." He began to collapse, but held on slowly, stepping toward the bear with the shivs raised. "Sleep," it repeated. His eyes closed, and he angled his fall with the shivs pointed, hoping they'd find a target before he lost consciousness. Wayne brought down the axe with a grunt, taking a piece of a root that was attempting to sneak into the space closer to the maw. The root bled red and began to shrink back. On either side of Wayne were other collar with axes. They'd been pruning the garden back in shifts for days, but it was still spreading, and every few days someone else wouldn't return with the rest of the group. Wayne took a few steps away from the hungry, twisting roots and pulled a flask from his belt. He took a long sip of water. He knew that was all he was going to be able to have for the afternoon, but gods did it feel good to feel its chill spread through him. "Wayne, good to see you alive," said Orbus, approaching from the tunnel behind along with 3 other men carrying crude axes. "Time for a shift change?" "That. And Merle was looking for you." "Lose anyone?" Wayne shook his head. "No, it wasn't too bad this time. Maybe the kobolds are getting the worst of it on their side." "Hope not. They've been the only ones really helping." Wayne looked at a root, trying to be subtle by wriggling across the ceiling. "Care for a gamble?" he asked Orbus. Orbus laughed. "You really missed that dice set you lost? You have no fucking idea." He chuckled again, his muscles rippling as he did so. "What's the bet?" "You and your boys will be pushed." Wayne took Blood's old axe and carve a line near the center of the cavern they were in. "Here, by the time we relieve you again." Orbus scratched his chin. "What's the bet?" "I still have a bit of the weed that Clay gave us for protection. How about you cover my shift tomorrow if I'm wrong?" Orbus nodded and held out his hand. "Deal." Wayne shook the offered hand. Then he and the men headband began their walk back toward the undermarket, all 3 of them covered in sweat and exhausted. Wayne hoped he won that bet. He wanted a damn break, and unlike Merle and his closest followers, he didn't get some sick thrill out of sore muscles and an exhausted body. The undermarket was packed and miserable. It had the same stench that the maw used to have on supply drop days. As the garden had spread, it had forced more and more people toward the maw, but not quite into the maw itself. The tree hadn't shown any signs of eating anyone yet, but the red leaves on it matched the garden, and people weren't eager to test their luck. Not to mention the dozens of guards sitting up at the top of it with crossbows. He walked through the tent and shack city to the old consortium building that the Collard had taken when the majority of the small fucks hid in the deeper, smaller tunnels where they would be safe, taking most of their supplies with them. He spared a hateful thought for Pilly and Hood disappeared with them. If he hadn't led them to the garden, if they hadn't started that fight and spilled all that blood at once, well, it was impossible to say that that's what had started the garden's violent spread, but the timing was certainly suspect. The collared guard pointed at him as he approached. "Merle is looking for you." Wayne sighed. All right. He just wanted to lay down a bit. Maybe thumb through the old grimoire till it left him. He found himself regretting his hesitation at climbing the tree for the 100th time since Dantes had left. He walked through to the conference room and stepped inside. He found himself walking into the middle of a conversation between Merle, Sin, Feltak, and Iron. He stood awkwardly at the door until Merle silently signaled for him to take a seat behind him. "We will share our food supplies with those you leave behind. We can enter the garden unimpeded and gather fruit as we need, or forage deeper in the Underprison. The garden has no interest in user blood offends it," said Sin in the form of a dwarven woman in a leather vest and businesslike boots, her hair color shifting between black, gray, and purple as she spoke. "That should help those unable to climb. The cripples, the old, the weak," said Merle, gripping a piece of metal that he bent and unbent with each squeeze. Iron snorted, adjusting his eye patch with a 3-fingered hand. "We should just distribute that food to everyone making the climb. We'll need to fuel more than they will hear. The story has been illicitly taken. Should you find it on Amazon, report the infringement." Feltak smiled a sharp-toothed grin. "This one wonders if you would feel the same had you lost just one more finger?" Iron glared at him. "The tools, the hooks and cloaks. How are they coming?" said Merle, defusing. Feltak looked at Merle. "The color of the cloaks nearly matches the color of the tree, and we have all of them we'll be able to make. Many will need to go without. And the hooks? We had plenty of metal thanks to Iron in the chamber pot," said Fel, his smile not dropping even as Iron gripped the blunderbuss at his hip. Merle sighed. "We only have to get along until we're topside. Let's hold off on it until then." Iron took his hand off the gun. "Don't worry. Once I'm topside, the first thing I'm going to do is find that mutt that did all of this, stick my gun in his mouth, and pull the trigger." Merle and Sin exchanged a glance. "All right, that's everything I think we need to discuss. We make the climb in 2 days. Keep trying to get more people in on it. The more people, the harder it will be to stop us all." Feltak nodded and left the room, his white scales reflecting the candlelight inside as he moved. Iron followed him with a respectful nod to Merle and a scowl to Sin. Sin moved to close the door, changing into a long-legged elf to make it take just 3 strides instead of 5. When the door latched, she shifted into a halfling to more comfortably fit into a smaller chair next to Merle and Wayne. "You wanted to see me?" asked Wayne, willing to bet that this was about Dantes. "We had some questions for you about Dantes." "Well, hopefully you didn't waste any of his luck on that internal bet. I've already said everything, haven't I? I told you what he told me about the garden, about his warning. All of it. But how did you feel about what he told you?" asked Sin, leaning forward intently, her eyes shifting between red and orange in such a way that they reminded Wayne of a crackling fire. "Sad, I guess. We were about to bury Tell. I definitely got the impression he was trying to help us. Like he was trying to pay off a debt to us before he left." Wayne paused. He hadn't had time to really examine his feelings with everything that had been happening, but he realized he didn't hate Dantes. He had the feeling that Dantes didn't know what would happen when he left. Merle brought his hand to his beard and began stroking it. "What were you thinking just there?" Wayne raised his eyebrows, but told them. "That's what I wanted to know. Of those of us left, you knew him the best, but you still weren't aware of his abilities until his escape. If he knew the fate he was leaving us to, we would need to know, but you don't feel he did? No. Why give us those other warnings like he did? Why help us before he left the way he did, if he had it out for us? Or didn't care? Well, I trust your word. I told you. Dantes didn't know. His powers are completely new to him," said Sin. "At it novel been at." "Sin, no offense, but you're not the most trustworthy person, and you're clearly biased toward Dantes." Sin didn't respond, but her eyes shifted to a stormy gray. "I'll heed your view on this in mind, but I'd like to speak to my man alone." Sin smiled and nodded, shifting into a kobold as she left the room. Merle sat there silently for a few moments, then he stood. "Do you know why I'm in this prison?" "I've heard some rumors. That I changed someone into a chicken and ate them?" "Yes. Well, That is what happened. Wayne chuckled, before seeing Merle's face and realizing he was completely serious. Really? Yes. We'd had an argument. We were both professors on the academy board, and ID proposed softening the ranking exam, changing it from a full week to just 4 days. Wayne nodded. The ranking exam was the final test all students at the academy took. A full week in a room, taking a series of magical exams. It was enchanted to make it, so you needed no sleep, no sustenance, no physical relief, and the professors rotated constantly with different requirements. Your score determines your place in the academy or what you'd be licensed to do outside of it. Wayne had performed thoroughly middling, but had just been glad he'd gotten through it at all. There were windows in that room, and magical nets for catching the students that jumped the nets didn't always work, though. For days would still be brutal, but by the 5th day, it was really only a test of endurance, not actual skill or talent. Why are you telling me this? I want you to know that I don't regret it, and I thought that he tasted delicious and had served a far better purpose in my stomach than he ever had in life. Wayne simply sat there quietly. He doubted Merle was done talking. What I'm trying to say is it was perfectly justified to throw me down here. Hells, most of us deserve this punishment, but we're all going to try and make the climb in 2 days because it's not about what we deserve, it's about what we want. Merle stood. The small chair had been on creaking in relief as his weight was removed from it. Do you know what I want? Another chicken? Merle smiled. I want to get my people out of here, get these collars off of our necks, and cast spells again. More than that, though, I want to make some changes in the city. Big changes. I think Dantes could be helpful there. A druid, their powers are unique, largely unknown even in the academy. I know we have some people that would rather see him dead. You want me to persuade them? That or tell me who they are so I can. Just among our own people. I don't expect us to soften anyone else's hearts on the matter. I can do that. Good. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to see if there's anything heavy enough outside to give me a decent workout. Wayne nodded and then left the building, his stomach growling from the talk of chicken. He looked out over the huddled remnants and survivors in the pit. Had heard how they'd talked of Dantes since he left. He was spoken of alongside names like Gideon Gallant, Tristan Two Lives, A the Greenblight. Had become a legend. Most called him Dantes the Deceiver. Some called him the Climber, or even the Destroyer. Only those who knew a thing or two about the world outside of Rendhold, a world where green was the dominant color instead of gray, and you were more likely to see tigers than stray cats, knew what his name should truly be. Dantes, the Druid. Zach, Jason, and Jake sat on a too-soft couch in an opulent parlor listening to the sounds of a man being beaten to death in the other room. They looked at the gaudy gold and purple curtains, the richly brocaded furniture, and the thick and heavily patterned carpet. Independent of one another, the different pieces could be considered beautiful, but together they created a maddening mix of patterns that created a cacophony of visual noise. Jake noted it immediately as the kind of thing that happened when someone with no taste very suddenly had lots of money. Jason scratched his leg absently. The wound head received from the crossbow bolt had been healed, but paying for discount healing had left him paranoid that something was still wrong with it. He sipped the cup of tea that the maid had prepared. It was flavorful, but had been sweetened too much for him to tell what specific notes he was picking up. He shot the maid a smile. "It's quite good." She nodded, keeping a neutral expression. Zach leaned on the edge of the couch at the far end. His eyes set on the door from which heavy thuds, whimpers, and the occasional scream were ringing out. He clenched and unclenched his fist as he sat there, finding himself reaching for the sword that had been at his waist only a half hour before when Head surrendered it at the front door to the manor. The sounds of the beating ceased, and heavy footsteps came to the door before it swung open. The man who pushed it open moved over to the maid, who had picked up a silver tray, and he removed the brass knuckles from his hands, letting them fall onto the tray with a clang. They were covered in blood and hair. The man then moved to a nearby desk, opening it and pulling a cigar which he lit, and enjoyed a long inhale of before putting up a cloud of silver smoke. He slicked back long blonde hair as he walked toward the couch. He was wearing a black silk shirt with the sleeves rolled up and dark gray pants held up with brown leather suspenders. He was large, with clearly Orcish ancestry, but his face was oddly boyish and youthful, only showing his age when he furrowed his brow. He sat on the couch across from them and took another inhale, holding it with his eyes closed for just a moment before letting out another large cloud of smoke. Sorry about the wait. I had to deal with a fucking idiot, and it was too pressing to wait. It's no problem. Mondego, sir, said Jason. Idiots are an enormous problem, actually, but of course you meant you're waiting. He took another inhale. Cigar? Yes, please, said Jason. Zach also shook his head, but Jake held up a hand to indicate he wasn't interested. Mondego snapped his fingers. Give them a couple of the cheap ones. The ones from Frashiet. She nodded and left, returning with 2 cigars which she lit for both Jason and Zach. As Jason inhaled, he realized it was the nicest smoke head ever had. So, Bane told me that you boys are escapees from the pit. That true? Yes. He nodded slowly. Then he leaned forward, any sign of affability completely fading from his face as he fixed them with a glare that could bore a hole in concrete. How did you escape? A tree grew in the middle of the mall. When we saw it, we started climbing. The guards had no idea how to RE it. Mondego held up a hand for him to stop. That's enough. He looked at what appeared to be a half-black and half-gold ring on his middle finger. Before you escaped, did you ever encounter someone named Dantes? This narrative has been purloined without the author's approval. Report any appearances on Amazon. The 3 of them exchanged glances. Yes, said Jason. We met him a few times. Describe him to me. He was a mutt. Dark gray skin, black hair, gold eyes, not quite average height, too big nose. Mondego nodded, clenching and unclenching his fist. He was alive when you left? Far as we know. And did you ever work with him? Would you call him a friend? Jake shook his head this time. We did do a job for him. Be up a gnome. Wouldn't call him a friend. He acted like he was too good for us. Refused to work with us because of what we called ourselves. Mondego continued to glare at them in silence for a few moments. Do you know if he escaped too? Jason shook his head. No idea. We were mostly just focusing on ourselves. Mondego leaned back. You wouldn't be lying to me, would you? Jason eyed the door that Mondego had just come through. He wasn't lying, but he was certainly being careful about how he told the truth. No, sir. Mondego nodded. All right. I'm putting you under Irelet for now, at the docks. She needs extra muscle down there for some big shipments we got coming in. He stood and started unrolling his sleeves. Ask my man Trinner that brought you here, and he'll take you to her. Should we tell Bane, sir? Asked Jason. Mondego gestured for his maid to bring him his coat, which she needed to stand on a stool to hold up for him to slip on. Wouldn't be a reason to. I just finished beating him to death. Oh well, report to Irelet right away. Please do. And if you hear anything about Dantes getting out, or anyone else, you come to me immediately. Unless you'd prefer to wind up like Bane. Yes, sir. Good. Now get the fuck out of here. I have more important people to see. The 3 of them quickly left and headed back out for the street. Mondego stood there, chewing on the end of his cigar more than smoking it. He looked at the maid, sent a message to the temple. I want that bastard here now. She nodded quietly and left the room. Mondego stood there alone in silence for a moment before sending his will through the steel ring in his right hand and summoning his morning star. He let out a primal yell and smashed it into a dresser. In one strike, it was in splinters, all of which bounced harmlessly off of him. He dismissed the mace, returning it to where it was stored. Someone get the fuck in here and clean this up. Trinner had turned out to be more interested in visiting his favorite whore, and so had left Jake, Jason, and Zach with some slapdash directions to where Irelet was. They walked through Midtown together as they made their way to the docks. We're sure this is the right call. I mean, telling half-truths and playing things close to the chest, this could fuck us in the long run, said Jason, stepping around a dust addict scratching himself in the middle of the alley. So could committing fully one way or the other. We know that Mondego hates Dantes. We know that Dantes hates Mondego. We think Dantes escaped, and now both of them have reason to trust us in regards to the other. Zach drummed the hilt of his sword as they walked. I don't see why we couldn't just join up with the Adventurers Guild or one of the merc companies, or even just sign up to serve in the Navy. Shit's gonna get bad here. He looked around at the dingy, wet streets. Things are already bad here. We could just leave. Jake shook his head. Everywhere is bad, but this is the place to be. All we have to do is keep working for Mondego. Eventually Dantes will come for him. And that pretty wife of his. Jason let out a high-pitched whistle. Shit, I'd be bitter about losing a piece like that too. Jake nodded, right? Anyway, as I was saying, hell come for Mondego, and when he does, we'll be perfectly positioned to pick a side. We betray whichever one of them we think is going to lose and wind up in a way better position than where we started. Unless we fuck it up and make the wrong choice, countered Jason. Well, no plan is perfect. I just think it's our best chance. I'd rather stick with Dantes, said Zach simply. Mondego seems like an asshole. Jake shook his head. I don't know. Mondego is what he is, but Dantes is harder to read. I think I'd prefer to go with someone whose intentions are obvious. At it novel been at. We'll just have to vote on it. When we get to that point, though, I do worry about betting against Dantes. He seemed to be on a losing team every time in the pit until he wasn't. Hard to gauge that, said Jason. Not to mention he's a fucking mage, added Zach. We don't know that he's a mage, but he's definitely got something fucking going on. Even just having a contact that's a magic seed guy is a boon of a sort if highly specific. They walked in silence for a bit longer, the smell of sea air starting to hit them as they reached the edge of the docks. They started passing sailors, fish carts, and rough bars as they got closer to the warehouse that Irelit was supposedly in. You know, I think we'll like working in the docks better than Midtown, said Jason as they passed a cart full of rotting and fly-covered fish. Why is that? Asked Jake. Smells better. Dantes drifted in and out of consciousness for some amount of time, between 30 seconds and 5 hours. He had flashes of consciousness in which he saw streets, abandoned buildings, and an old haggard tree that he could swear he watched two wolves walk into, and after that there was just an overwhelming sense of green. When he fully regained consciousness, he found himself tied to a tree. He looked around to see nothing but dirt, wood, bushes, and branches. He panicked for a moment before realizing that Jacopo was in a small net next to him, also attached to the tree, but still fast asleep. He started to test the strength of the vines he was tied down with. As he pushed against them, he realized they weren't tied down, they were simply wrapped around him. And as he struggled, they tightened to limit the amount he could move. He considered changing into a rat, but before he could, he heard a noise and turned his head to see two wolves emerging from the woods to his right. One of them was dragging the bloody and battered corpse of a dead deer. As it walked toward him, it slowly shifted from being a shaggy black-haired wolf into a tall, naked man. He had tattoos across his chest that looked like wolf paws, as well as one that looked like a crescent moon. His hair was down, but Dantes recognized him as the man that had grabbed him of the vixen only a few weeks before. He clenched his jaw. He should have realized that there was something else going on with the man. Had even forgotten that the man had warned that he'd be coming for him on the next full moon. The man dropped the dead deer on the ground, his mouth covered in blood and a bit of viscera. He looked at Dantes expectantly, as if expecting some sort of reaction. Dantes had a number of questions. Why had the man kidnapped him? Why was he tied to a tree in the woods? How did they get there? But in the lingering haze of whatever had put him to sleep and his disorientation, there was only one question he could actually get out. Why are you naked? The man blinked. He had not expected that question. I was in wolf shape, he said as if that explained it. So, when I'm in rat shape, I keep my clothes. The man opened his mouth to say something else, but was interrupted by the landing of a massive white eagle holding 3 rabbits in its beak. It dropped its prey and shifted slowly into a second man. This one an elf with broad shoulders and long white hair that barely contrasted almost translucent skin that was absolutely covered in golden tattoos, too many to actually identify which animals they were meant to represent. He was also naked. He turned to Dantes. You really don't take to my sleep ability well, do you? The amount of times I've had to will you to sleep would make an elephant comatose for a week. Dantes had no idea what an elephant was. The deviant says he keeps his things with him when he changes shape. The elf frowned. That is very odd. Dantes looked at the 2 naked men that had just changed from animals to people and still had fresh blood coating the edges of their mouths. Yes, I'm the odd one. Excuse me for implying otherwise. Dantes could feel his wits returning as he sat there. "You're druids, right?" The white elf nodded. "Why did you kidnap me?" "Because you need to be initiated," answered the elf. "And an invitation wouldn't have sufficed. You refused your first invite. It's too dangerous to let an uninitiated druid wander without guidance. You're a risk to yourself and your locus. You could do irreparable harm. Blood rituals, accidental spread of disease, preservation of one species over another. We had to bring you in." As he spoke, the man began cleaning and gutting the hare's head just brought down. The other man leaned over the deer carcass, eating it raw. "This tail has been unlawfully obtained from Royal Road. If you discover it on Amazon, kindly report it." Dantes noted the inclusion of blood rituals on the list, but decided to err on the side of caution and find an indirect way to ask for more information later. "I didn't realize I was being invited. It seemed more like an attack at the time." The elf looked at the man shoving raw deer meat into his mouth next to the gray furred wolf that Dantes guessed was bound to him in the same way he was Jacopo. "How exactly did you approach him?" "Grabbed him. Told him to come with me. City was too noisy, too smelly, too different. Made me feel bad. Couldn't even detect life there. Wanted to leave as soon as possible." He spoke between mouthfuls. The elf put his hand on his face. "Mother, grant me patience." He muttered under his breath. He looked at Dantes. "I'm sorry. He was raised by wolves and doesn't have a lot of experience with cities and manners." That was clear. Why send him at all? He was the closest. No one else could force walk there until the full moon. The trees in Rendhold are too weak to transport to otherwise. If had convinced you to leave the city, it would have saved a lot of time and lessened the risk you posed. The wolf druid spat. "Don't need to explain things like this to prey." "How's your leg?" asked Dantes, recalling that Head buried a dagger in him the previous night. He growled. Dantes ignored him. "So, you wanted to initiate me and give me a heads up on a few things." He fucked up the normal invitation. "So you came to Rendhold to drag me to it forcibly?" "Yes." "Where are we now?" "The Viridian Expanse, or Abbey Forest if you're elvish." Dantes blinked. "I have no idea where that is." "It's in the center of the continent. Roughly 5 months' travel from Rendhold." 5 months. Dantes felt his mind prune a number of options for escape and combat from his mind in an instant. "Well, 5 months by flight anyway. We got here in moments, of course. It's only been half a day." Dantes nodded. ID figured. He sat there for a few moments. "Will we be able to transport back the same way?" "Yes. In fact, we'll show you how to do it yourself." Dantes raised an eyebrow at that. Teleporting great distances in an instant now, there was a useful power. "No, we won't," said the wolf man with confidence. "He is not worthy of that, and the conclave will agree with me. We are too few to be so picky when a new brother arrives." Merc. "Better to be dead than to accept the weak and tainted treason." Dantes listened quietly, doing his best to absorb what he was hearing. It wasn't exactly the subtle innuendo of practiced politicians trading barbs, but he stayed focused on it anyway. He had a strong feeling that he needed every advantage and scrap of information he could hold on to. "Any chance you can release these vines?" asked Dantes. "I don't have a reason to run, especially since I'm so far from Rendhold. Besides, I want to know more about what it means to be a druid." He was being sincere as he spoke. Had been wanting more guidance on being a druid for quite some time. This wasn't his preferred way of learning, but he'd take what he could get. "Oh, certainly." Trazen made a gently sweeping gesture toward Dantes and Jacopo, and the vines constricting both of them loosened. Dantes stood and brushed himself off, then picked up a still sleeping Jacopo and placed him in his jacket. "Will he be all right?" Trazen nodded. "Of course. I just had to put him asleep when we were halfway here. He attempted to free you and attacked Merc as well." Dantes smiled and gave his pocket the same friendly pat he'd give it when it was full of a particularly good haul of pickpocket jewelry. "Thank you." He sent the thought to Jacopo. It was likely selfishly motivated. After all, they were connected at the soul, but he still appreciated the gesture. He felt some slight movement in the pocket, but Jacopo didn't wake up. "So, what does this initiation entail?" "A pool, a tree, a full moon, and the stars." "Vague. No schooling beforehand?" "I have questions." "Well." "No," interrupted Merc. "He won't be initiated." He will not be given the sacred mysteries. If he's not going to be initiated, then it won't really matter if I answer a few questions, will it? Merc frowned and cocked his head. No. Dantes stayed silent during the exchange. It was immediately clear to him that if he wasn't initiated, he would be killed or at least reduced in some way. He got the distinct impression that the druids didn't talk to people very often. The elf may have been attempting to be subtle, but to Dantes they were two of the most open books had ever seen. It was like seeing a whore saying, "Pay me for a fuck at a brothel," instead of "Join me for a drink." Their feelings were written openly across their faces and body language. Not to mention another obvious indication that they really seemed unsocialized. I have a few questions, but before we do anything, can I ask a small favor? Merc said no, and Trazen said yes at the same time. Would you both mind putting on some pants? Dantes followed behind Merc and Trazen as they walked through the Viridian expanse. Dantes had never been in a forest before and found himself overwhelmed by it. The trees ranged wildly in size, from small bush-like things to some that seemed almost as mighty as the mother's reach had planted. It was somehow both quieter and louder than Rendhold ever was. He found himself twitching and jumping at the sounds of frogs croaking and crickets rubbing their legs together. And Rendhold had slept through murders going on 3 feet from his door and the sounds of pub brawls just a hallway away. He attempted at one point to extend his senses out, but was immediately overwhelmed and had to pull back. It reminded him of when he had first gotten out of the pit and was overwhelmed by all the new life around him, only multiplied 100-fold. He heard a snort from Merc. Dantes said nothing. Instead, he tried again, but this time he expanded his senses more gradually, moving them further and further outward. When he got overwhelmed, he'd pull back, but then he'd try again and make it just a bit further. The elf gave him a strange look, but continued leading the way. Had been kind enough to put on some blue pants and a matching shirt. They looked finely woven, but old and well-worn. Dantes would guess they were noblemen's clothes if they weren't so dirty. Merc, on the other hand, had shifted into the form of a wolf rather than put on clothes. He wove through the roots and bushes with the gray wolf next to him, where they occasionally brushed up against one another. Dantes felt overheated and uncomfortable. Trying to train his senses took his mind off of it, but it was too much novelty too quickly. He considered removing his jacket, but the constant brushing of branches and brambles against him made that an equally unpleasant option. We teleported through trees, right? Right? Answered Trazen. Why didn't you take us straight there? Are you familiar with the saying about the needle and the haystack? No. Is that like finding the gnome at the halfling bar? Possibly. This forest is large, and moving to it from a distance makes it hard for one to choose exactly the right place at which to arrive. We're only about another 2 hours away, though, unless you can shift into something flying. Dantes looked at his woefully underfilled batmark. Afraid not. Trazen nodded. Walking at his then, they continued in silence for a while longer, while Dantes continued processing and organizing his thoughts. So, Trazen, are you not bound to another animal? He looked back, smiling. Oh, I am, but we share a body and soul completely now. Dantes looked at him questioningly, but he didn't seem to pick up on it. What do you mean? Her physical form passed on, so I took her into myself. We are one now. He patted a gold-filled tattoo on his chest with an open palm as he spoke. The tattoo was the largest of them on him. Dantes had no clue what animal it represented, but whatever it was big. That sounds unpleasant, sent Jacopo to him. The idea of being one like that. Jacopo shuddered a bit in his pocket. Vile. Glad you're awake. This isn't exactly the kind of situation I want to be in alone. That's selfish of you. Yes, but it's also true. These 3 are strong. Separate, we could have beaten them, but together we will need to break them from each other. Stolen from its original source, this story is not meant to be on Amazon. Report any sightings. Dantes sent a mental summary of everything Head picked up on from the 2 druids so far. Useful. We stick it out then? For now. But we should be ready for anything. Jacopo gave a grunt in confirmation and climbed up Dantes' arm and onto his shoulder. Good morning, Rat. Sorry I put you to sleep for so long, said Trazen toward Jacopo. Jacopo cocked his head. I understand you. He said this out loud, rather than through a mental connection. Yes, I can speak with all animals, not just those that I've received a blessing from. Useful, said Jacopo, mirroring Dante's own thoughts. You mentioned before things ID need to be warned about. Spreading disease, favoring one kind of animal, blood magic. Care to elaborate? Merc growled, but Trazen ignored him. Well, you may not know this, but there are many diseases that can be spread between animals, plants, and people. Dantes nodded. Yeah. They quarantine blocks in Rendhold when that happens. Wait for things to burn themselves out. You have the power to encourage things to go places they might not normally go. Make certain populations mingle that shouldn't. I've seen entire forests wiped out, whole colonies of penguins and mammoths killed because disease that wouldn't have spread if not for an ignorant druid flexing her new power or even spreading disease intentionally. Trazen's expression grew grim at the last line. So, I'm guessing favoring one kind of animal over another can have an impact like that too. You start making lions leave deer alone, and soon the lions are starving, but the deer are everywhere causing problems? Exactly. And blood rituals? Asked Dantes. Head danced around it to avoid placing suspicion on himself, though he wondered if they would have been savvy enough to pick up on that. He also wondered if Merc had noticed the mother's reach head grown in the center of Rendhold. He hadn't mentioned it. Perhaps the most dangerous thing a druid can do, but one that is instinctually granted to us by the mother. The use of your own blood to grow, control, or bind animals and plants. It is acceptable to use on the one you're bound to, but otherwise it is incredibly unstable and dangerous. The hunger for blood and life just grows, and they eventually begin to seek it outside of the druid's control. It is also risky for the druid. You are bound to everything in your locus that you contribute to. Your strength, energy will all come from what and how you cultivate it. Eventually, your life becomes bound to your locus. When you use blood magic, you're binding yourself far more tightly, putting your own life at risk if what you have cultivated comes to harm. Interesting, he responded, as the blood drained from him and his mind began to rapid-fire ways to mitigate and respond to the damage he may have unwittingly done. He had told Wayne how to monitor the garden. It was possible that they'd been providing it enough blood to keep it content. After all, it had only been a month. There was a good chance he'd be able to get them a warning or some other information if he could locate a consortium contact. There was another part of his mind that began turning to ways he could use blood rituals intentionally to his own benefit. Sure, there was a risk, but there were definitely use cases where it would be worth it. He couldn't even say he regretted his use of it so far. It hadn't been as if Head had much choice. Had it novel been at. Dantes continued following, much better able to ignore the heat with new information to focus his mind on. Eventually, they reached a large clearing at the center of which was a small lake, and in the middle of that lake stood a mighty tree. He could feel the tree's presence radiating through everything around him, and he realized that much like himself and the cords of energy he felt weaving their way to the living things he grew, the tree was connected to everything in the expanse in the same way. He noticed something else as they got closer to it. It almost looked as if it had a face. He saw movement, and turned his head to see a woman with dark skin and flowing black hair swimming through the lake alongside a massive scaled beast that reminded Dantes strongly of a leviathan, except it was much too small and seemed to have legs rather than flippers, and green scales rather than blue ones. He also saw a young male gnome with azure hair sleeping on the branch of the tree with a large cat of some kind curled around him. Finally, he noticed two women, one of them braiding the hair of the other, while two large falcons sat perched nearby. Both of the women were at least partially elven and tall with auburn hair and purple eyes. They, and their falcons, were twins from what he could tell. Looks like we aren't the last to arrive. I don't see Cole or Morgan, said Trazen, primarily to himself, as they walked into the valley. Dantes looked around at the motley crew that was assembled. Not as many as I expected. Trazen shook his head sadly. There used to be more. That said, we've never been a very large brotherhood. Is this just all the druids that are nearby? He shook his head. No, this is all that remains on the continent. Dantes looked over the 7 that were assembled. He didn't know much about geography. His studies mostly consisted of his mother and Vera insisting he knew his numbers and letters, but he did know that Cargus, on which Rendhold sat at the northwest end, spanned an enormous part of the mortal plane. Had once heard sailors say that a man could be born on one end of it, and if he started walking at that moment, had be an old man by the time he made it to the other side. This was far fewer than had expected. As Dantes walked into the glade, he could feel the attention of the other druids slowly shift to him. The woman in the lake was the first to approach, pulling herself out of the water with her strange creature in tow. She was nude at first, but then some kind of green plant spread across her flesh until it covered her like a dress, even weaving its way through her hair until it was pulled back from her face. He found himself a bit disappointed by that. She was much nicer to look at than Trazen and Merc. If she'd been the one to retrieve him, had been slower to mention her lack of clothes. She circled him for a few moments, and he could feel the attention from her eyes going up and down him. This one reeks of cities and smoke. Dantes shrugged. I haven't exactly had a chance to bathe since I got here. The twins approached next, their birds taking off from the ground and drifting in a lazy circle around the glade. I sense that he favors the little ones, the things that live in the cracks and slip through the dark places. The twins' voices were the same, and as they spoke they continued one another's sentences seamlessly. It was mildly disconcerting, but had seemed stranger. I think it's good for someone to be more interested in the little guy, for a change, said the gnome with a smirk. He was standing behind Dantes, though he hadn't sensed him moving or arriving there. The massive cat that was with him was gone, but now there was a snake twisted around his body, its head peeking out from the gnome's blue hair. Everyone, this is I never did get your name. It doesn't matter, said a once again human Merc as he walked toward the lake and dove and head first. Dantes ignored him. Dantes, he said with a smile and an inclination of the head. He smiles without meaning it. A deceiver, said the dark-skinned woman astutely. At it novel been at. It's the way of things where from to smile, even if you don't mean it. Helps to put people at ease. He followed her with his eyes as she continued to circle him. We also have a habit of exchanging names. Lorna, she said, and this is Beast. He looked at Beast. Up close he reminded him more of a kobold, but larger, fatter, flatter, and scarier. He's a handsome guy. Lorna squinted. True. Dantes turned his attention to the twins. She is Fern. She is Ivy. They are Cloud and Wind. They spoke the third part in unison, and the falcons gave out cries from above them that made Jacopo flinch slightly. Dantes looked at the gnome. The snake had transformed again and was now some kind of ferret, rolling around in the grass. Fizz and that thing. Dantes watched as Thing changed form again, this time into some kind of amalgamation of a duck and a beaver. An apt name. We thought so, said Fizz. Dantes turned his attention back to Trazen. So, you said we're waiting on 2 more, but when do we do the initiation? Or decide on it? We will decide once they arrive, and the initiation will occur when the moon is high. And how is it decided? A majority? A vote? He shook his head. No, you must convince us all. Dantes looked at just those who were there so far. Merc hated him on sight. Lorna seemed immediately cautious of him. The twins were inscrutable, and Fizz seemed to be the only one who may be friendly toward him aside from Trazen. He'd either need to convince them that he deserved what was being offered, escape and make his way across the continent, or kill them and then have to do the same thing. Seemed like the first choice was the one he'd have to go with for now. After a bit more conversation, some discussions involving hunting for food, and a couple additional back and forths between himself and Lorna, or himself and Merc, Dantes found himself left to his own devices. The task ahead was clear, and while his own life appeared to be at risk, the rest of the druids seemed unbothered by the fate that awaited him. Fizz went to hunt for everyone, while the rest of them either napped or swam or climbed trees. Dantes approached Trazen, who was napping bare-chested in the sunlight, his white skin practically glowing under the sun's rays, forcing Dantes to squint. Trazen, you mentioned that there were fewer druids than there used to be. Why is that? If you stumble upon this narrative on Amazon, it's taken without the author's consent. Report it. Trazen kept his eyes closed as Dantes spoke to him, but his gentle expression became harsh. Many reasons. Dantes leaned against a tree. Listen, I get the feeling you're on my side, that you're in favor of my initiation, but there are several that clearly aren't. Any information you give me could help. Treason stayed silent for a moment, and Dantes thought that maybe he wasn't as on his side as had thought, but then he spoke. Ciri, Ren, and Rendhold were killed when a nearby city moved into their loci, and they fought back. Braddock lost too much of his locus while attempting to negotiate keeping his forest under the laws of the land, but they changed their laws and cut down trees until there was nothing left. Serpica left the Brotherhood willingly, made many strange claims about carrying her locus within himself, and has not appeared since. There are many stories like these from many brothers and sisters. Dantes nodded as he listened. It wasn't difficult to draw the lines between what Treason was telling him and the distaste several of the druids had for him. Between the pit and Rendhold itself, Dantes knew hatred. It wasn't a complicated thing to determine. Those of you say fought back. How did they do it? Treason's frown deepened. It was clear that recalling was painful for him. Ciri attacked logging camps cloaked in darkness, tearing the throats from the loggers with a pack of wolves until they hunted her down and killed her, though she took many with her. Ren attacked the encroaching city directly with a swarm of ravens. She tore her way through the people at the outer wall, but there were mages there talented in fire magic, and she was burnt down along with the rest of her unkindness. Rendhold dug with his great mole and would pop out of the ground to drag people down, hoping to use fear to keep them away. They collapsed his tunnels, and he suffocated in the earth. Dantes listened intently. The druids weren't stupid. Their plans made sense and were well thought out. They didn't just attack randomly and hope for the best. Still, they were missing an important piece of understanding in how a city worked and how a society pushed forward. Dantes could use that. Has there ever been a druid with a locus in a city before? Not in my last few hundred years. Berkelak may have known one, though. He's lived far longer than I. Berkelak? I have not met him. Treason's grim expression softened a bit, and his lips curled into a wry smile. Oh, you have. He's been here the entire time. He just prefers not to speak much. Dantes raised an eyebrow and looked across the glade again. He saw the druids still occupied in their various leisure activities, though Fizz still hadn't yet returned from his hunt. As he looked around, his eyes gradually moved toward the center of the glade, where the tree grew in the center of it. He felt the same kind of handshake acknowledgement that Head felt when he and Jacopo met within his mind, but in this case, it was like he was shaking hands with a giant. Hello, came a voice in his mind, and though it spoke with a kind of gentleness, Dantes nearly collapsed under the weight of it and felt the connection break. Dantes took a few deep breaths to steady himself and looked at Treason again. He's a tree? Treason shook his head. He's the forest. He became one with his locus, his companion, everything. How does that happen? Treason shrugged. He's the only one who's ever managed it. But when I asked him, he spoke as if it was a very simple thing. It requires a binding, a vow, and a sacrifice. Nothing more. Dantes looked at the tree. He could sense the tremendous power of Berkelak and of the forest that surrounded, but it didn't appeal to him in the slightest. Power without the ability to enjoy it physically, to count gold while feeling the weight of it in your hands, see the fear in an enemy's eyes up close, to fuck. No, being a tree didn't appeal to him in the least. I'm guessing he gets a vote too? Yes, though he's going to vote in your favor. His trust in the mother is absolute. In his eyes, if she chose you, then that's good enough for him. Dantes made his way over to Merc, who he identified as his harshest critic. If he could convince him to vote in his favor, then that would be a good step in paving his way. Merc was in human form, laying against his gray wolf companion by the lake. Near him floated Lorna, laying on the back of her creature and sunbathing as it floated lazily in the water. Merc, he bared his teeth. I just want to talk to you. No, come on. The mother must made me a druid for a reason. Merc ignored him, instead sitting silently. Well, I can always give you my theory while you stare angrily at me. Merc stared at him angrily. I think she wanted me for two reasons. The first is to tell you how to properly fight against a city encroaching on your territory. Trazen told me about your fallen brothers. Weak, grunted Merc. It didn't sound to me like they were. Their approaches made sense. Hit and run attacks, using fear, trying to take hold of the offensive. The only problem is that they didn't know what a city craves. Dantes thought of Rendhold, the largest city on the continent, the only one that was both a country and a city in one. Other countries boasted grander capitals, freer ones, but not matched Rendhold in scale and reach. Had seen more than his fair share of Sailor Gawk, or get lost within its massive maze like confines. Its borders were ever expanding, consuming everything inside and outside of it. Cities don't care how many are sacrificed. They just want more. The dead druids attacked people, and thought that was the key, but cities can always produce more desperate men, and women whole take a dangerous job no matter what. The key is to make it costly. Attack the equipment they're using, kill the men that ordered the incursion into your territory to put fear into the city's leadership. Blood is cheap unless it's blue, and equipment paid for in gold has more value than labor bought with copper. Merc stayed silent, but he could swear that the gray wolf he sat on had her ears perked up. I could also get you tools that could help. Explosives, acid, magic items, not for free of course, but I'm sure we could find a way to help one another out. Merc continued to say nothing, just sat there indifferently with an angry expression on his face. Dantes shrugged. It looked like he may need to find a way to slit his throat before a decision was made, or simply remove him from the immediate area. He was fairly certain He'd be easy to bait to a different location, but actually beating him would be hard. He wasn't exactly in his element in the forest, and he didn't have a lot of resources to work with since he hadn't exactly been prepared to travel across the continent into unknown territory with a conclave of druids about to decide his fate. There was also the fact that Berkelat could likely sense what was happening everywhere in the Viridian expanse. That meant there was little chance He'd be able to get away with it. He clenched his jaw as he moved over to the water to splash some onto his face, Jacopo leaping from his shoulder to drink as he did so. He may wind up benefiting from what was happening, so He'd managed to tamp down his frustration, but it was starting to get to him. He wanted to be in Rendhold. He had plans to initiate. Old friends to kill. Lorna and her gator seemed to appear suddenly next to him, nearly making him flinch as they emerged from the water. What was the second reason you think the mother chose you? She asked as she pulled her wet hair away from her face in a practiced motion. Dantes looked at Lorna and the strange green creature shed called Beast as they moved to sit next to him. Her eyes were dark, almost black, and he found his own drawn to them, like looking down a dark passage in the pit, and sensing something there that he couldn't quite make out. You said you think the mother chose you for two reasons. You explained the first one to Merc. What was the second? You have good hearing. Yes. Dantes glanced at Jacopo, who was still boldly drinking water, as Beast sat less than a foot away from him. The second reason I think she chose me is hedging. Hedging? It's clear that druids are dwindling because of their conflict with cities, and it sounds like a few other issues. By making me a druid in a city, she's hedging her bets, making sure that at least one member of the Brotherhood will survive by being on the side of the largest city. She scoffed. A weakling's mindset. The mother doesn't hedge bets. She is one of the greater gods. If we die, it is because we are weak, and she has no use for us. Ah, I'm guessing you don't think I should be initiated then? She shook her head. Oh no, I do. The first point you made to Merc has convinced me. Bombs, magic tactics. The floating city of Chitlin does not encroach on my swamp in the way a city that rests on solid ground might on the nature which surrounds it, but they already take more than their fill. It will worsen with time, and I must be ready. Dante nodded, taking note of her conviction. He wondered what She'd be willing to trade with him. He wasn't sure what a swamp would have to offer him, but had keep an open mind. He glanced again at Beast. Can I ask what manner of creature he is? Some kind of swamp dragon. You've never seen a gator before? He cocked his head. Never even heard of them. She knelt down and gave Beast a rough scratch on the scales of his neck. He opened his mouth and closed his eyes in a clear display of contentment. That is sad for you. They are the greatest of the mother's creatures. He looked at the row of razor-sharp teeth on display and nodded. Yes, I feel very deprived about it. With their conversation done, he approached the twins next. He found out while Fern was on his side, Ivy wasn't, and she needed some convincing. Luckily, unlike Lorna, she was convinced by the idea of him being the mother's insurance in case the Brotherhood came close to falling. They were also both tentatively interested in gunpowder. The suggestion of what havoc they could cause with their birds carrying bundles of bombs seemed to clinch the deal for them. He spoke to Fizz last, who returned to the glade with 2 dead deer being pulled by an ox, which shifted into something too small for Dantes to make out, then disappearing in the grass. Don't bother. I've been listening in this whole time. Well, we all have been. Hard to keep secrets in a grove full of druids. Dantes knew that, but had already felt that not visiting them individually could be seen as disrespectful, or he may come up with some new argument in his favor on the fly. Well, where do you stand so far? I was with you from the start, as was Thing. A small field mouse popped out of Fizz's blue hair, morphing into a small bird to do a short lap around Dantes' head. How's he do that? Asked Dantes as he watched Thing change. The same way you or I do. We can change. Why can't the animals we share souls with? If you encounter this narrative on Amazon, note that it's taken without the author's consent. Report it. I haven't seen any of the others do it. Fizz shrugged. We all learn things at a different pace. Or sometimes one of us can just do things another can't. Druid abilities are instinctual, and we tend to learn what powers we're best suited for first, as do our companions. He held out a finger for Thing to land on, which it did as a bird, before becoming a lizard and scurrying up his arm. Why would I want to be anything other than a rat? Asked Jacopo simply. Dantes shrugged. Makes it easier to eat or kill something bigger. Or easier to get small enough to slip somewhere you couldn't fit before. Or fly. I'd bet flying is very fun. Jacopo nibbled on the edge of Dantes' collar in consideration. I'd still prefer to be a rat. Thing let out a kind of choking sound that Dantes somehow recognized as a laugh. A strong identity. What a waste of time that is. Dantes found himself remembering Sin and the other changelings. He still needed to find the magister that had sentenced her to the pit. Now that he was building favor back up and no longer needed to search for Gaspard, maybe he could turn his attention in that direction. He needed to start monitoring Danglars anyway. Well, I appreciate having you on my side. Let me give you another piece of advice. Dantes raised an eyebrow. Don't worry about Merc. Focus your attention on everyone else. Convince them, and he'll go along with it. He's a pack animal at heart. Dantes nodded. He didn't have much of a choice at this point anyway. The next hour was spent gutting and cleaning the deer that Fizz had brought before putting most of it over the fire to cook, leaving a good chunk of it raw for everyone's beastly companions. The twins spent some time foraging and returned with a number of roots, berries, and nuts that supplemented the meal. Overall, it was a bit bland to Dantes compared to what had been eating at the Vixen, but still well above what had been eating in the pit just a little over a month before. As they dozed after eating, there was a commotion in the brush at the edge of the glade. Dantes turned his attention in that direction to see 2 shapes approaching. The taller of the two, Dantes realized, was in fact a dwarf riding a large boar. He had a wild gray beard and wore a tattered cloak over a well-worn traveling outfit. His eyes were a pale green that caught the light of the setting sun, and his boar's eyes matched. The boar's hair was also the same color as the dwarf's beard, which was so long that for a moment he couldn't tell where the dwarf ended and the boar began. The second figure was a slight kobold with bright yellow coloring spotted with black. She had a black raccoon on her shoulder, and both her and the raccoon were wearing backpacks that made light clinking sounds as they moved. As she got closer, Dantes could sense a sickeningly sweet smell emanating from her that was somehow not canceled out by the cacophony of smells the rest of the druids gave off. "Cole, Morgame, welcome." "I was beginning to grow concerned," said Trazen as he approached them. Cole got off his boar and lifted Trazen by the legs in a powerful bear hug. More simply gave everyone a curt nod before zeroing in on Dantes. You are the new one." Dantes nodded. "Yes, I'm Dantes. Nice to meet you." She looked him over, approached, and smelled the air around him by flicking her tongue in his direction. There's an interesting mix of environments within your locus." am also picking up a deep low-light environment near strange energies. Dantes raised an eyebrow. He hadn't been in the pit for quite some time, and had bathed frequently since had gained the ability to do so regularly. Quite frequently with the help of additional hands that cost him a few silver. You have impressive senses. Do you know of any native poisons in your locus? Or any curatives? Dantes thought about it. Come to think of it, it seemed very foolish of him to overlook the potential of poisons and medicines with his new abilities. It also didn't surprise him that a kobold druid would have put the incredible focus of her species into investigating that. I know that Greenleaf helps with wounds, and I think arrowroot can mess up a stomach, but aside from that I don't know much. Don't mind a bit of weed for a headache, though some prefer dust. Her face turned disappointed as he spoke. Greenleaf could refer to many things, as could arrowroot. Assuming him initiated, he'll talk to an herbalist and bring samples the next time all of the druids are called here and give them to you. Her expression brightened a bit. Maybe you could teach me a few things about poisons in exchange. Her expression brightened even more. Yes, that would be excellent. The raccoon on her shoulder nodded in agreement. Cole approached shortly after, with his hog snorting and snarling behind him. And you be the filthy city dweller trying to join us? If you'll have me. You gonna fight? Only when I fight dirty. You good to your friends? As long as they stay friendly. Do you love plants, animals, and life of all kind? Dantes paused. He hadn't really thought about it before. As a kid had thrown small bits of bread into the water at the docks to see the small fish slurp at it from down below. As a young man had fed and cared for the mascot for the purring princess, a long-haired white cat that had nearly beaten a man to death overstepping on. Even when he was in the pit, he still took the time to water the plants he found and shared some food with Jacopo. I do, he responded after standing silently for a few moments, speaking with a sincerity that was rare to him. Cole spat in his hand and held it out. It would be an honor to call you brother. Dante spat in his own hand and gave Cole's hand a firm grasp. Cole released his grip, leaving Dantes with a hand that had gone from gray to black where he had touched, and then looked across the glade, his stomach audibly rumbling. The group ate the meal together, some in silence, others with some light chatting. There was a comfortable familiarity to the group that Dantes sensed had been developed over many years. He himself felt like an interloper, but considering he had been kidnapped and brought there, he didn't feel much awkwardness about it. He ate his own food quietly, listening to the others' conversations and trying to absorb what he could about them. Jacopo sat next to him, nibbling some meat off of a small piece of bone. He seemed unconcerned by the possibility that they might be killed, but Dantes took that as a vote of confidence from him. He felt he had everyone's support except for Merc, and if what Fizz had told him was true, then he should be covered there as well. He popped a handful of berries into his mouth and looked up at the sky. The full moon was high and shining, and the light of it that shone down on seemed to fill him. He felt as if he were buzzing, vibrating with a kind of energetic anticipation. The others had gone silent, as if they were feeling the same way, and they all stood, almost as one. Dantes found that he was on his feet as well, Jacopo taking his customary place on his shoulder. He walked toward the lake, reaching the edge of it, and found that he was facing Berkelac, the reflection of the moon above sitting between them in the water. He could feel, implicitly, in the same way that his druid abilities had been implicit, that he needed to step into the lake. The other druids were around him as he moved, and he stepped into it. The water was cool, and he found himself slowly submerging until he was about waist deep, nearing a third of the way to the center. He took a few more steps and pushed himself forward, floating on his back. The other druids all took their places surrounding him, each one of them placing a hand on him. They were going to submerge him. He felt at peace with the idea, overwhelmed by the energy that surrounded him, and seemed to suffuse the lake itself. Before they pushed, he felt his full attention snap back, and his mind try to overrun the instincts he was acting on. No, he started to struggle, but before he could, all of the other druids' hands pushed him down at once. He didn't just sink down, he was falling through the water, moving far more quickly toward the bottom than seemed logically possible. He sank for far longer than his mind told him he should have, given the shallowness of the pool, and it became more and more of a struggle to hold his breath. He tried to move his limbs and fight, but they were leaden. His chest began to feel as if it would burst. He tried to will Jacopo to leave him, to send him a message to swim out if he could, but he heard no response and had no idea if had been heard or not. He could hold his breath for nearly 4 minutes, but he hadn't exactly been keeping time before he began to sink. He held on for a bit longer and then let the final bit of air from his lungs. He felt a moment of relief that came with letting that last breath out. Then his lungs began to fill with water. Oddly, the panic he had been feeling began to subside as the water filled him. He felt the same sensation he'd been feeling when he'd been looking up at the moon. Energy began to fill him, then something else. A flood of sights, sounds, and sensations began to assault him. He could feel warm mud oozing across his skin, taste crimson blood dripping down his throat as he bent to a fresh kill, see across a massive and desolate desert made of ice, hear the loud chirps of a baby bird begging for food, and smell the dank dampness of a cave filled with fungus. These sensations shifted rapidly across his perceptions as he felt a part of himself began to expand to start to encompass it, growing just fast enough to keep him from filling up and bursting. All of the sensations he was feeling ended abruptly, and he found himself surrounded completely by darkness and an absence of all sensation. In front of him appeared a great white bear. Then next to that was a mighty gator, then a boar, a pair of falcons, a raccoon, a strange multicolored lizard, and finally a wolf. One by one, they were each bathed in golden light, starting with the bear. The light spread until it touched all of the great beasts except for the wolf that sat there wreathed in black. The other animals looked at it, fixing it with their full attention. The wolf grimaced and bared its teeth, leaning forward with its tail raised. Then it shook its snout and sat back on its hind legs, curling its tail. It let out a howl, and it too was bathed in golden light. Dantes felt strong roots reach out from below him and begin pushing him back toward the surface. His ascent was as rapid as his fall, and when he broke the surface he was launched forward, landing on the grass next to the lake. He coughed up water for what felt like an eternity, only just conscious enough to notice Jacopo next to him doing the same thing. He could hear a chorus of voices and sense a cavalcade of emotions from all around him, and he moved his hands to cover his ears, but the sounds didn't stop. Stolen content alert. This content belongs on Royal Road. Report any occurrences. He felt a powerful hand on his shoulder and looked up to see Trazen looking down at him, smiling. Sleep, brother. Sleep. This time he didn't fight it. Dantes awoke facing the sky, the moon and stars shining down brightly upon him. He hadn't noticed before, but there seemed to be far more stars in the sky than had ever seen over Rendhold. He could even make out some that seemed to be different colors and depths that had never noticed before. He could hear what sounded like a party going on near him, and sat up slowly, his head pounding and the taste of copper in his mouth. He saw that the other druids had resumed their meal, adding something that gave off the smell of alcohol to the mix. He sensed that Jacopo was there as well, and as he struggled to his feet, he could hear Jacopo talking. The streets are filled with food that two legs think themselves too good for, and there are thousands of good places to hide and burrow. As Dantes got closer, he noticed that Jacopo was standing on a raised stone, talking to an enraptured audience of druids and their companions. Sounds better than I expected, said Beast in a low, droning voice. Good places to hide for him, but not one so big as you, chided Lorna. I think it sounds perfect, responded Morganme's raccoon. He could understand animals he hadn't received a blessing for. This visit was turning the prophet had hoped already. That's not surprising, interrupted Dantes. There are quite a few of your kind living in the outer regions of Rendhold. Welcome back, brother, said Trazen. Jacopo was just telling us of your exploits. Dantes quickly sent for an explanation from Jacopo, who sent back a brief collection of recent memories that indicated to Dantes exactly what he feared. Jacopo had told him everything. He smiled, trying to play off the pit that now rested in his stomach. Well, I hope it wasn't too boring. It was very interesting. We had not expected. So much violence, but seemed necessary. At least, mostly necessary, said the twins. Blowing up a bunch of elves? Cole shook his head wistfully. Reminds me of my childhood. Not all elves are like that. Besides, Jacopo shot a dwarf as well. Cole snorted. He shot a royal. They're not real. Dwarves. They're prissy babes that trim their beards and wear silk. Dantes nodded politely. Had heard the no true dwarves argument more than once. It was a favorite of every dwarf to indulge in why he was a real dwarf, but another dwarf wasn't. You're a criminal, noted Merc with a note of distaste. A thief and a murderer. Dantes looked at the man. Had finally put on pants at some point, but he was covered in mud and reeked of wet fur. Yes, I am. Since when do you care about laws? Asked Fizz, beating Dantes to the question. All the beasts in the woods steal, kill, ambush, trap, and betray. That's what nature is. Seems to me he's just following the laws of the mother more closely than the laws of men. Merc clearly didn't have a response to that, and compensated by snorting and looking away. He's just moody because he didn't even realize that a mother's reach growing in the center of city wasn't normal, said Trazen. Dantes felt the temptation to underestimate Merc, but resisted it. A lack of experience with other people and an unfamiliarity with life outside of his own hadn't kept him from nearly killing Dantes the previous day, even after Head thrown everything Head had at him. No, Head need to stay wary. So, there's no punishment for using blood ritual? Trazen shook his head. It was not as if you could have known what would happen. I only wish we could have sensed you before you left your prison, but we were blocked somehow. Had we known before we initiated you, it may have been a problem, and if it is not something you've resolved before we next meet, there will be consequences, but for now, I'm simply happy to welcome a brother. Dantes looked back up at the moon and felt the kind of energy from it leading to a nearby tree. The other druids and their companions all went silent as well, as if drawn to the same energy. Dantes got the impression that it was time for everyone to return to their own locus. We will meet on the next full moon, said Trazen, looking over at the others. At it, Novel Benedat. Dantes nodded, looking over at everyone. Bring something to trade, and it'll bring samples of what I expect some of you might want from me. He winked at Morganme. And don't worry, we'll make sure to visit an herbalist as well. She returned the wink, her tail curling a bit, and the raccoon on her shoulder gave Jacopo a bow which he ignored. They started to drift apart when Trazen stopped Dantes. Brother, look at your arm. Dantes blinked, looking at his right arm that was covered in marks before switching to his left, where he noticed that he now had a number of gold leaves on his arm. One for each person in the glade, including Berkelak, and another one that was wilted and gray. When one of us is nearby, those leaves will fill. When one of us is in danger, you'll be able to sense it, though you may not be able to respond to it. What about this one? Asked Dantes, pointing at the gray and wilted leaf. Trazen's expression darkened. That one won't tell anything anymore. Don't concern yourself with it. Dantes was curious, but he felt the pull from the tree and was more than ready for his time with the druids to come to an end. He moved to the tree and placed a hand on it. He could feel what he needed to do. Jacopo moved up his arm to place his hand on the tree as well, and then they both pushed forward, sinking into it. Traveling through a tree was probably Dantes' least favorite method of travel. He felt his sense of self momentarily disappear and become one with a kind of primal and natural force before being flung back into oneness and reality through another tree across the continent. The first time Head done it, had been unconscious, but losing that sense of self while aware was distinctly horrible and uncomfortable to him. So much so that when he landed in an abandoned square in Rendhold and fell onto hard concrete, it was a relief to him. He sat up and looked at his hands, counting and flexing his fingers as he regained his composure. He could feel that his senses had been heightened by his initiation. He had a general impression of the state of life with his locus within Rendhold that painted a distinctly negative picture of rot and misery. He chuckled, had known about that without any druid abilities. He felt a pull from the tree behind him and turned to face it. It was an old, ugly, and murlied thing. The ends of its branches looked like clenched fists, and the wood of it was a dark gray-brown, but in spite of the state it was in, he felt an enormous presence from it. He sensed the life within it pulsating, but also that it was much faded from what it used to be. As he was focusing on it, a particular pulse of life traveled from its roots and up to a branch near him. It was as thick as his forearm, and just a bit longer. He reached out and touched it, feeling it as the tree cut off the life that was flowing into it, leaving a pocket of itself within the branch. Dantes bent the branch, and it broke off with almost no effort. He held the branch in his hand. It had a good weight to it. He wasn't sure what had compelled him to take it, but going with his instincts had been the name of the game that day, so he hadn't questioned it. He adjusted it in his hand. If it was just a bit thinner on one end, it would make a solid club at the very least. At that thought, the club shifted, lengthening on the thinner end until it fit perfectly into his palm. He was reminded of how Lorna was able to grow and move the leaves she had been using as clothing. He focused his will on the branch, this time picturing it becoming thin and malleable, wrapping around his arm. Slowly, it obeyed his will, wrapped around his right forearm until it looked like a particularly ugly bracer. He realized it was covering his marks and willed it to make space to show them, which it did. This has nice possibilities, he thought. He moved it to his other arm where it would be less in the way. He looked up at the tree head, retrieved the branch from. Head sensed it was a gift of sorts. He placed his right palm on the tree. Thank you. He felt a gentle acknowledgement of the thank you and looked around. It was still night, but the moon was slowly starting to fall. He needed to find a street he recognized and begin making his way back to the Vixen. It was time to start moving things in earnest. Dantes moved until he reached an area he recognized. He wasn't in Midtown, but rather had been taken all the way to the southwestern part of the city. It would be more than an hour by foot to get back to the docks. Hard to complain about an hour walk, though, when you just traveled thousands of miles in an instant. He moved across the still slick streets, seeing the occasional lurker in an alley, but otherwise finding that section of the city deserted. The southwest end was under control of the gatemen, and was where one of the side gates into the city was located. Of course, the city had grown a long way out from the old wall, but it was still one of the major areas through which goods passed on the way to or from the docks. Stolen content alert. This content belongs on Royal Road. Report any occurrences. Even at that time of day, the streets were typically much busier, which set him on edge as he walked. He sped up, cutting through alleys and letting his innate sense of direction guide him until he started to get closer to the edge of the docks. There, he started to notice a number of guard patrols gathered at the intersection of a few major streets. He shifted into rat form and got closer along with Jacopo to hear what was happening. Section by section, until you've cleared your area. The city wants arrests, and we need to give them to it, or ITLL be our asses. Not our fault the fucking jail losers couldn't keep a lid on our prisoners, muttered one of the guards, at it Novel Bennett at. You're damn right, it's not our fault, yelled the sergeant, who Dantes noticed was at least half-elven, which the muttering guard should have noticed, and muttered more quietly. But that doesn't matter. Everyone with a uniform is going to be blamed, and we've got orders all the way at the top from Councilman General Crant to round up everyone we can. How will we know if we've found a prisoner? Well, a number of them were mages, so they'd have collars around their necks. That being said, it doesn't matter if you know that the person's a prisoner or not. The city wants arrests. Just assume anyone you find out here looking suspicious needs to get rounded up. Where will we even put them? The Underprison doesn't exactly seem like an option since they just broke out. We're packing them into the holding jails for now. Any more fucking questions? Or are all of you done with excuses and ready to bust some skulls? Bust some skulls, sir, yelled the majority of the guards in unison before they started tearing through the streets. Dantes stayed in rat form until he was a good distance away from them, then shifted back to his usual self. There'd been another prison break, and a good number of those that had escaped were collared. That explained the empty streets. Had Wayne escaped? Had Merle? His own escape hadn't prompted nearly this level of response, which seemed to indicate to him that more people had gotten out this time, and it was no longer possible for the guard to keep a lid on things. He needed more information and to start looking for any of his fellow prisoners. He wanted to help those that he knew, but more than that, there were opportunities here. He could use his abilities to help smuggle people out of the city for a price. There was also the chance that some of the enemies had escaped the pit as well. Those he'd want to be able to keep track of as well. He rubbed his temples for just a moment and allowed himself a single pour me. Why did these things all seem to happen in waves? If it was one problem at a time, it would be significantly easier to manage. He let that self-pity go and started moving again. Whatever was happening, he needed to get back to the Vixen. He made it there as the sun was rising, frequently changing into rat form to avoid patrols of guards. But truthfully, it wouldn't have been difficult to avoid them even on foot. The city was too big for the guard to control, always had been. The guard were more about projecting the illusion of control and enforcing the will of Uptown on everyone else. Sure, there were the guard that worked outside the walls and actually did some work to defend the city, but they were practically their own entity. The Vixen was closed, with only the gentle glow of a candle in one of the windows, but Dantes hesitated. Something fell off, and he could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He shifted into rat form and began circling the building. He found one man across the street on the roof, looking at the entrance. A woman with a crossbow sat in the alley behind the building, keeping watch. And a third man he sensed through a roach watching the front door with a wand gripped in his hand. Dantes felt a rage build in him, but held back. He smelled no blood and could tell that all the women of the Vixen were fine, with Zilly even beginning her cleaning of the main room, ignoring the man with the wand. Dantes had been found, and likely by Mondego. If it had been the guard, they wouldn't have been nearly so subtle. Still, he couldn't exactly leave all of the things he had hidden under the floorboards there, and he also needed to make sure Vera and the girls would be all right. Worst-case scenario had need to kill the thugs and get them to safety. He had a feeling Vera would have other plans. Dantes slipped past the watchers on the Vixen easily as a rat and climbed up to the windowsill of his room, where the window had been left cracked to allow Jacopo an easy entrance and exit as he wanted. Once inside, Dantes did a quick search of the room as a rat before shifting back into his usual self. He quietly walked the room, collecting his things into his pack and lifting the floorboards to find the goods head hidden and pack them as well. Once he was done, he gently opened his door and slowly pushed it open, letting Jacopo do a quick survey of the hallway before he himself stepped out. He creeped to Vera's door quietly. Watching for the floorboards he already knew from experience had a tendency to creak. The mage at the bottom floor was a full-blooded elf, so he needed to move as quietly as possible, even though he felt a sense of urgency that pressured him to move quickly. He tested Vera's door and found it locked. He began to reach for his makeshift lock picks from the prison that Head had yet to replace, but hesitated. He reached his left hand toward the doorknob and willed the branch that surrounded his arm to grow toward it. He sent out 2 small protrusions and focused on the sensation the branch felt so that he could get a feel for the tumblers. After only a moment, he had it unlocked and gently pushed the door open. He withdrew the branch back to his arm as he walked inside. Waiting for him was Vera, holding a delicate pistol in her hand and aiming at his chest. His eyes widened in surprise. "Dantes," she whispered, quickly removing her hand from the pistol's trigger. "I thought you were one of those thugs." Dantes slowly and gently closed the door before turning to her. "You scare me for a second, Auntie," he said quietly. "Sorry. I've been up all night listening in case one of them tried to force themselves on the girls." Dantes nodded. "That was always a concern. They're here looking for me?" he asked. "At it novel been at." Vera nodded. "They are. Mondego sent them after the news about the second breakout. They told us that Mondego sent them to burn the place down, but Mercedes begged him to stay their hand. They were almost too keen to emphasize that point. Where were you?" "Paying a visit to Gaspard." Vera nodded. "That's one I certainly won't argue against. It was good that you were gone. Much easier to control the situation. What was your strategy?" "I told them that you had been here, then I sold you out in return for them, leaving my girls alone." "You're heartless, Annie." She shrugged. "I need to be. Besides, I figured that you would be able to tell if something was wrong. I already got my things, and I have a way out, but I feel hesitant to leave while you've got 3 killers here putting you and the girls at risk. Wanting to take care of them? You all go into hiding. Mondego would burn this place down if you did that, and a lot of these girls have no place to go. No, it's better for you to slip out. She moved to her desk and quickly scribbled something onto a piece of paper. She held it out to Dantes. Take this note and go to the guild district. There's an underground fight there near the Hell's Forgotten mercenary headquarters. Give this to a man named Vampa. He's tall and broad, an elf with the tips of both of his ears clipped. What'll he do for you? He's the Vixen's protector. Give him a note, and Hell watch the building to make sure that Mondego's goons don't do anything to harm us. Will he need payment? This content has been unlawfully taken from Royal Road. Report any instances of this story if found elsewhere. No, he does it out of honor. Dantes tucked the note into his pocket, noting the hint of pride in Vera's voice when she said the word honor. He had wondered how the Vixen protected itself, but he hadn't expected it to be a single man, much less one that Vera would trust so thoroughly. Still, if he could make contact with him, that would allow him to turn his attention to Mondego and attack the root of the problem. I'll go to him right away. I don't like leaving you all like this. He gritted his teeth a bit, remembering the conversation Head had with Zilly nearly a month prior. He could have moved into one of his gardens sooner and maybe mitigated the problem, or avoided going to Vera at all. He just wanted a small taste of his old life. A little bit of familiarity and friendship with a woman that helped raise him, not to mention the opportunity to satisfy some more bodily desires. It's not a crime to ask for someone to help you, Dantes. You're not so important that everything bad that happens is entirely your own fault. The moment you showed up on my door, I knew what I was doing by letting you stay here. I knew you were the one that led the breakout, and that you'd gained some kind of advantage you didn't have before. It was as much my decision to let you stay here as it was yours to come here. Dantes grimaced, ashamed that he had been read so easily. He opened his mouth to say something, but changed the topic as he began to speak. They'll find Vampa, Annie. Be careful in the meantime. She nodded, then surprised him by wrapping him in a hug. Be careful at least as much as you can be. He returned the hug. I will, Annie. Take care of the girls. She nodded, and Dantes slipped out the door. Had been watching it with Jacopo, so he knew it was clear. He went back to his room, shifted into a rat, and climbed out the window and onto the street. Had been careful to leave no trace of his visit, and for what he could tell the people watching the Vixen, they had no clue about it either. The sun was officially out, bathing the wet streets in light and creating soft, reflective pools of standing water. It was pretty to look at, unless one paid attention to how filthy the water was. He skittered down a few alleys with Jacopo, leaving a couple rats and roaches to keep an eye on a Vixen. Whether or not Vampa could help, he still needed to keep watch himself. Once he was far enough away, he switched back to being himself and helped Jacopo into his pocket. The streets were starting to fill with people again, and while they looked wary and concerned, and the guard presence was heavier, it was still busy enough that no one would be looking his way. He was reasonably clean, had no obvious collar, and had a lot of experience keeping his head down. He made it to the guild district just before early afternoon. There the guard presence declined significantly, as the mercs and adventurers were too unruly to handle on their own, and the tradesmen guilds were protected and respected by those groups as so much of their equipment and resources were purchased from them. Had heard more than a few stories of a rookie adventurer taking advantage of Cooper's daughter or some such only to be found dead the next day. He did see a few posters put up by the guard indicating that any adventurer or merc that captured a prisoner would be compensated for their efforts. Dantes didn't have a lot of experience in the guild district. Mondego's father had worked there as a relatively accomplished carpenter, but he never visited, and Dantes didn't have any interest in apprenticeships or grueling work. Gaspard had once pitched stealing from a few of the jewelry craftsmen at the source for raw gold and gems, but both Dantes and Danglars knew that they were much more valuable and easy to sell once the crafting was done. Besides which, it was much easier to deal with the heat from the guard from robbing a jewelry store than it was to deal with whatever fallout a guild member may be able to muster against them. Dantes took things slow as he walked through, taking things in. He noticed that a number of storefronts were closed, likely driven out of business by the factories closer to the docks, but there were still a number of specialists about. He passed coopers, enchanters, jewelers, carpenters, blacksmiths, woodsingers, and even a number of fey-binders. As he reached the center of district, the average person went from wearing smocks and heavy aprons and holding tools to wearing chainmail and leather with swords and bows at their backs and daggers strapped to their legs. As he walked, he started to be swept up in a current of people that was slowly pushing in the direction of a nearby arena, the one maintained by the Adventurers Guild. Curious, and heading in that direction anyway, he allowed himself to be swept up into the thick crowd. As he moved, he slipped his fingers into nearby pockets and jackets, slipping anything coin-shaped and cold into his many pockets without ever actually looking down. There was no reason to waste being surrounded by a distracted crowd with full pockets. He eventually found himself in the stands of the arena himself, needing to peer between a pair of tall elf men to see the sand-bottomed pit below. There were 5 men in the pit, and for a moment he thought it was a free-for-all, until he caught a better glimpse and realized that 4 of the men were all facing one in the corner. Dantes watched incredulously, checking with the rats at the Vixen for just a moment. Things seemed to be going as they usually did, with a few early morning sailors pairing off with the girls. The goons seemed to have switched to watching things in shifts, with the one on the rooftop taking a nap and the girl in the alley now inside for a drink. He looked around. He was basically boxed in, and pushing his way out would draw a lot of attention to himself. So he resigned himself to watch the fight and turned his full attention to the pit. The 4 mercenaries on one side were a diverse group. There was a woman in the back with a bow, a man in front wielding a 2-handed warhammer, another man with a spear, and a woman with a long, thin blade. They were all armored, and while he didn't recognize the markings, he was fairly certain they were highly ranked members of different mercenary organizations, and they were also in the Adventurers Guild ranked wolf, which he remembered being relatively high up as well. It was common for the mercs to work as adventurers between wars, kept the gold flowing. The solitary man was shirtless and covered with sinewy muscle. His hair was long and light brown. He was human, as far as he could tell, but as pretty as an elf with a smile that seemed to reflect the sun directly into Dantes' eyes. If Dantes had looked like him, he would have started working at the Magnificent Stallion in Uptown and lived a good, full life following his mother's career path. He found himself rooting for the other 4 combatants. Before the fighting started, the handsome man with the staff raised it high. "I offer the effort of this fight in the name of the God of Justice." Dantes stifled a laugh, his inner cynicism not allowing him to take the statement seriously. He was surprised, however, when the statement was met by a cheer from the rest of the crowd. He turned his attention to listening to what people were saying around him. "Can't believe he's here. Last I heard, he was dragon slaying in Vicent. He's wanted in Frashiad for freeing that slave caravan. No way he killed a demon. I do believe the Minotaur, but a demon? That's crazy. His sun spear is supposed to be able to harm even spirits. Why is he here? Can't be the prison break. It just happened. He'd have had to cross the continent in almost no time at all." Dantes raised an eyebrow and appraised the man again. There were those in the city that gossiped about this adventurer or that, but it had never had much appeal to him. Mondego had liked to play at adventurer as a kid, since he saw so many of them when he went to his father's shop in the guild district, but Dantes had been busy picking pockets. A horn blew, and the fight began. Dantes expected the man with the staff to be on the defensive at first, but was surprised when instead he launched himself forward at the man with the warhammer, thrusting the tip of his staff at his face. The man with the warhammer managed to just barely move his head out of the way of the strike, but the staff quickly slammed into the side of his head, the speed of the strike causing the staff to actually bend before it snapped into place against the man's face, causing his head to spin toward the ground and his body along with it. The man with the spear moved to strike in unison with the woman wielding the rapier, and just as their strikes were about to hit the man with the staff, he seemed to vanish, before they realized Head thrust his staff into the ground and was standing on the tip of it, grinning down at them. The bowwoman let an arrow fly at him, and he caught it with one hand before purposely falling from the tip of the staff toward the spearman, getting under his guard and shoving the feathered end of the arrow up his nose before tossing him to the ground with an open-handed push. Stolen story, please report. The man went to retrieve his staff, and the woman with the rapier began to strike wildly at him with a dozen thrusts, while the bowwoman began to loose arrows more liberally at him. He stayed calm, a smile on his face, as he dodged strike after strike. He somehow did so without giving any ground, moving only as much as he needed to avoid their attacks. As the spearman began to stand, he somehow batted away the rapier by hitting it with the flat of his hand. The force of that nearly spun the woman around, and when she regained her footing, he had his staff, which he brought down on her wrist, disarming her. The spearman launched himself at him, and they did some brief exchange of blows which the staff wielder fought off with only one hand on his weapon. Finally, as if growing a bit bored of the display, he drove the tip of the staff into the spearman's gut, caught the spear as the man began to lose consciousness, and flung it with such force that when it caught the bowwoman's hood, it threw her back into the far wall and embedded itself there, the force of it seeming to knock her unconscious. Dantes let out a breath. He hadn't realized he had been holding it as he watched the fight. It couldn't have lasted more than 2 minutes. Dantes had seen and been in a number of fights in his life. He knew he wasn't a good upfront fighter. In his group, that had always been more Mondeggo's role, as the biggest of them, but he didn't think of himself as bad at fighting. Head certainly won more than Head lost. That man was on a different level, though. Even the men and women Head, just defeated alone, would have slaughtered Dantes in seconds, and Dantes got the impression that the man could have fought them 10 more times without breaking a sweat. He must have had something divine or magical to him, but that was also beyond Dantes' ability to gauge. The man, now the last one standing in the pit, raised up his staff, and the crowd erupted into applause and cheers. Gawain! 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 His curiosity satisfied, and the crowd breaking up, Dantes began to make his way out of the arena and back out onto the street to search for the headquarters of the Hells Forgotten. He hadn't understood the appeal of adventurers as a kid, but if He'd seen someone like Gawain, there was a good chance he would have followed a different path. He could have been disarming traps and picking locks for treasure in a dungeon rather than to steal from someone else. Though, he supposed, you were stealing either way. Once just seemed more acceptable to the average person for some reason. Maybe because liches and dragons weren't considered owners of what they had. At it novel been at. Whatever the case, he wondered what it would cost to hire muscle like Gawain for a job. He had praised the god of justice, but at the same time, he was a member of the Adventurers Guild, which meant money had to mean something to him. Having that kind of power to throw at Mondeggo's operation was immensely appealing to him, but he doubted the practicality of it. Besides, it's a difficult thing to control something that strong. He could be deprived of the personal revenge he wanted if he sent someone like Gawain after him. Dantes eventually made it to the edge of the guild district, and it was there he finally found what he was looking for. The Hells Forgotten building was an old warehouse that had clearly been converted. In front of it were a number of rough-looking men and women covered in scars and wearing weapons on their backs or at their sides. Dantes considered asking them about the underground arena he was looking for, but reconsidered, instead pushing out his senses until he found a number of roaches crawling around in a large, open space underground. He moved toward where he sensed them and saw a seemingly abandoned building with a man leaning against a wall outside, half asleep. Dantes didn't bother talking to him, instead slipping past him and finding a stairway leading down almost immediately inside the building. The wooden steps quickly changed to stone, and Dantes realized he was in some closed-off portion of the ruins beneath the city. It opened up, and he saw a large pit in which a large elven man was striking a wooden post covered in rope. The force of his blows caused it to shudder, and the speed with which he attacked made him appear almost as a blur. He was a flurry of elbows and knees, but he stopped after a particularly strong blow that caused the post to make a loud cracking sound. With the man still, Dantes got a better look at him. He was broad and muscular, with a number of scars and burns across his body. His head was shaved, a rare thing for an elf, and his ears ended in horizontal lines where they'd seemingly been cut. One of those ears twitched as Dantes decided to make his footsteps loud enough to be heard.